Hey everybody. I don't know how much of this entire book I'm going to read, but I want to at least read some of the sections, at least the ones by Althusser from Reading Capital. The first section of, or the first piece from Althusser in this book is titled From Capital to Marx's Philosophy. Yeah, this is going to be something of a long piece, which I guess you'll know when you click the video that it's quite long. The section starts on page 9, or this part starts on page 9, and the next part doesn't start till page 73. So it's, how many pages? 60 pages? 60 some pages? 64? God, I'm dumb. All right, let's go. From Capital to Marx's Philosophy by Louis Althusser. To Citizen, this starts with a quote from Marx. It's a letter. Quote, Dear Citizen Maurice Chat. Dear Citizen, I applaud your idea of publishing the translation of Das Kapital as a serial. In this form, the book will be more accessible to the working class, a consideration which to me outweighs everything else. That is the good side of your suggestion, but there is a reverse of the medal. The method of analysis which I have employed and which had not previously been applied to economic subjects makes the reading of the first chapters rather arduous, and it is to be feared that the French public, always impatient to come to a conclusion, eager to know the connection between general principles and the immediate questions that have aroused their passions, may be disheartened because they will be unable to move on at once. That is a disadvantage I am powerless to overcome unless it be by forewarning, and forearming those readers who zealously seek the truth. There is no royal road to science. Only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining science's luminous summits. Believe me, dear citizen, your devoted Karl Marx, London, 18th of March, 1872. All right, that's the end of the letter, the introduction, or what's it called? What do you call that? At the beginning of a book. I always forget. That's so embarrassing. Epigraph, I think is the word I'm looking for. It says the following papers were delivered in the course of a seminar on capital held at the École Normale Supérieure early in 1965. They bear the mark of these circumstances, not only in their construction, their rhythm, their didactic or oral style, but also and above all in their discrepancies, the repetitions, hesitations, and uncertain steps in their investigations. We could, of course, have gone over them at our leisure, corrected them one against the other, reduced the margin of variation between them, unified their terminology, their hypotheses, and their conclusions to the best of our ability, and set out their contents in the systematic framework of a single discourse. In other words, we could have tried to make a finished work out of them, but rather than pretending they are what they should have been, we prefer to present them for what they are, precisely incomplete text, the mere beginning of a reading. So, Section 1. Of course, we have all read and all do read Capital. For almost a century, we have been able to read Capital every day transparently in the dramas and dreams of our history, in its disputes and conflicts, and in the defeats and victories of the workers' movement, which is our only hope and our destiny. Since we, quote, came into the world, end quote, we have read Capital constantly in the writings and speeches of those who have read it for us, well or ill, both the dead and the living, Engels, Kautsky, Plekhanov, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, Stalin, Gramsci, the leaders of the workers' organizations, their supporters and opponents, philosophers, economists, politicians. We have read bits of it, the quote fragments, end quote, which the conjuncture had quote selected, end quote, for us. We have even all more or less read volume 1 from quote commodities to the quote expropriation of the expropriators, end quote. But someday it is essential to read Capital to the letter, to read the text itself, complete all 4 volumes line by line, to return 10 times to the first chapters, or to the schemas of simple reproduction and reproduction on an expanded scale, before coming down from the arid tablelands and plateaus of Volume 2 into the promised land of profit, interest, and rent. And it is essential to read Capital not only in its French translation, even Volume 1 in Roy's translation, which Marx revised or rather rewrote, but also in the German original, at least for the fundamental theoretical chapters and all the passages where Marx's key concepts come to the surface. That is how we decided to read Capital. The studies that emerged from this project are no more than the various individual protocols of this reading, each having cut the peculiar oblique path that suited him through the immense forests of this book. We present them in their immediate form without making any alterations, so that all the risks and advantages of this adventure are reproduced, so that the reader will be able to find in them newborn the experience of a reading, and that so that he in turn will be dragged in the wake of this first reading into a second one, which will take us still further. Section 2. But as there is no such thing as an innocent reading, we must say what reading we are guilty of. We are all philosophers. We do not read Capital as economists, as historians, or as philologists. We do not pose Capital the question of its economic or historical content, nor of its mere internal, quote, logic, end quote. We read Capital as philosophers and therefore pose it a different question. To go straight to the point, let us admit, we posed it the question of its relation to its object. Hence both the question of the specificity of its object and the question of the specificity of its relation to that object, i.e. the question of the nature of the type of discourse set to work to handle this object, the question of scientific discourse. And since there can never be a definition without a reference, we posed Capital the question of the specific difference both of its object and of its discourse, asking ourselves at each step in our reading, what distinguishes the object of Capital not only from the object of classical and even modern political economy, but also from the object of Marx's early works, in particular from the object of the 1844 manuscripts, and hence what distinguishes the discourse of Capital not only from the discourse of classical economics, but also from the philosophical, ideological discourse of the young Marx. To have read Capital, as economists would have meant reading it while posing the question of the economic content and value of its analyses and schemas, hence comparing its discourse with an object already defined outside it, without questioning that object itself. To have read Capital as historians would have meant reading it while posing the question of the relation between its historical analyses and historical object already defined outside it, without questioning that object itself. To have read Capital as logicians would have meant posing it the question of its methods of exposition and proof, but in the abstract, once again without questioning the object to which the methods of this discourse relate. To read Capital as philosophers is precisely to question the specific object of a specific discourse, and the specific relationship between this discourse and its object. It is therefore to put to the discourse-object unity the question of the epistemological status which distinguishes this particular unity from other forms of discourse-object unity. Only this reading can determine the answer to a question that concerns the place Capital occupies in the history of knowledge. This question can be crystallized as follows. Is Capital merely one ideological product among others, classical economics given a Hegelian form, the imposition of anthropological categories, defined in the philosophical early works on the domain of economic reality, the quote realization end quote of the idealist aspirations of the Jewish question and the 1844 manuscripts? Is Capital merely a continuation or even culmination of classical political economy, from which Marx inherited both object and concepts? And is Capital distinguished from classical economics not by Capital's object, but only by Capital's method, the dialectic he borrowed from Hegel? Or on the contrary, does Capital constitute a real epistemological mutation of Capital's object, theory, and method? Does Capital represent the founding moment of a new discipline, the founding moment of a science, and hence a real event, a theoretical revolution, simultaneously rejecting the classical political economy and the Hegelian and Feuerbachian ideologies of its prehistory, the absolute beginning of the history of science. And if this new science is a theory of history, will it not make possible in return a knowledge of its own prehistory, and hence a clear view of both classical economics and the philosophical works of Marx's youth? Such are the implications of the epistemological question posed by Capital by a philosophical reading of it. Hence, a philosophical reading of Capital is quite the opposite of an innocent reading. It is a guilty reading, but not one that absolves its crime on confessing it. On the contrary, it takes the responsibility for its crime as a, quote, justified crime, end quote, and defends it by proving its necessity. It is therefore a special reading which exculpates itself as a reading by posing very guilty reading the very question that unmasks its innocence, the mere question of its innocence. What is it to read? Section 3. However paradoxical it may seem, I venture to suggest that our age threatens one day to appear in the history of human culture as marked by the most dramatic and difficult trial of all, the discovery of and training in the meaning of the, quote, simplest, end quote, acts of existence, seeing, listening, speaking, reading, the acts which relate men to their works, and to those works thrown in their faces, their, quote, absence of works, end quote, and contrary to all today's reigning appearances, we do not owe these staggering knowledges to psychology, which is built on the absence of a concept of them, but to a few men, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. Only since Freud have we begun to suspect what listening, and hence what speaking, and keeping silent means. Veut dire. That this, quote, meaning, end quote, voilà dire, I don't know, of speaking and listening reveals beneath the innocence of speech and hearing the culpable depth of a second, quite different discourse, the discourse of the unconscious. Footnote. We owe this result, which has revolutionized our reading of Freud, to Jacques Lacan's intransigent and lucid, and for many years isolated, theoretical effort, at a time when the radical novelty of what Jacques Lacan has given us is beginning to pass into the public domain, where everyone can make use of it and profit by its own way, I feel bound to acknowledge my debt to an exemplary reading lesson, which, as we shall see, goes beyond its objective origin in some of its aspects, in some of its effects. I feel bound to acknowledge this publicly, so that, quote, the tailor's labor does not disappear into the coat, end quote, Marx, even into my coat. Just as I feel bound to acknowledge the obvious or concealed debts which bind us to masters in reading learned works such as Gaston Bachelard, Jean Cavaillés, don't know, and now Georges Canguilhem and Michel Foucault. In some of my other readings, I look things up, but I actually own this book, Reading Capital, so I don't really have like a computer right in front of me to like look up every single person. So you're gonna have to do that on your own if you want to do that. And perhaps you'll like this listening to this better because I don't look up a million different things, but we'll see. So, end of footnote. I dare maintain that only since Marx have we had to begin to suspect what, in theory at least, reading and hence writing means. It is certainly no accident that we have been able to reduce all the ideological pretensions which reigned in high over the 1844 manuscript and still craftily haunt the temptations to historicist backsliding in Capital to the explicit innocence of a reading. For the young Marx to know the essence of things, the essence of the historical human world, of its economic, political, aesthetic, and religious productions was simply to read. Lesen, herauslesen, in black and white, the presence of the, quote, abstract and, quote, essence in the transparency of its, quote, concrete, end quote, existence. This immediate reading of essence in existence expresses the religious mood models of Hegel's absolute knowledge the end of history in which the concept at last becomes fully visible, present among us in person, tangible in its sensory existence, in which this bread, this body, this face, and this man are the spirit itself. This sets us on the road to understanding that the yearning for a reading at sight, for Galileo's, quote, great book of the world, end quote, itself, is older than all science, that it is still silently pondering the religious fantasies of Epiphany and Perusia, and the fascinating myth of the Scriptures, in which the body of truth, dressed in its words, is the book, the Bible. This makes us suspect that to treat nature or reality as a book, capital B book, in which, according to Galileo, is spoken the silent discourse of language whose, quote, characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, end quote. It was necessary to have a certain idea of reading, which makes a written discourse the immediate transparency of the true, and the real the discourse of a voice. The first person ever to have posed the problem of reading, and in consequence of writing, was Spinoza, and he was also the first in the world to have proposed both a theory of history and a philosophy of the opacity of the immediate. With Spinoza, for the first time ever, a man linked together in this way the essence of reading and the essence of history in a theory of the difference between the imaginary and the true. This explains to us why Marx could not possibly have become Marx except by founding a theory of history and a philosophy of the historical distinction between ideology and science, and why in the last analysis this foundation was consummated in the dissipation of the religious myth of reading. The young Marx of the 1844 manuscripts read the human essence at sight, immediately in the transparency of its alienation. Capital, on the contrary, exactly measures a distance and an internal dislocation, a décalage in the real, inscribed in its structure, a distance and a dislocation such as to make their effects themselves illegible, and the illusion of an immediate reading of them the ultimate apex of their effects, fetishism. It was essential to turn to history to track down this myth of reading to its lair, for it was from the history in which they offered it the cult of their religions and philosophies that men had projected it onto nature, so as not to perish in the daring project of knowing it. Only from history as thought, the theory of history, was it possible to account for the historical religion of reading, by discovering that the history of men, which survives in books, is however not a text written on the pages of a book, discovering that the truth of history cannot be read in its manifest discourse, because the text of history is not a text in which a voice, the logos, speaks, but the inaudible and illegible notation of the effects of a structure of structures. A reading of some of our expositions will show that, far from making metaphorical suggestions, I take the terms I am using literally, to break with the religious myth of reading. With Marx, this theoretical necessity took precisely the form of a rupture with the Hegelian conception of the whole as a, quote, spiritual, end quote, totality, to be precise, as an expressive totality. It's no accident that when we turn to the thin sheet of the theory of reading, we discover beneath it a theory of expression, and that we discover this theory of the expressive totality, in which each part is pars totalis, immediately expressing the whole that it inhabits in person, to be the theory which in Hegel for the last time, and on the terrain of history itself, assembled all the complementary religious myths of the voice, the logos, speaking in the sequences of a discourse, of the capital T truth and its inhabitants in capital S scripture, and of the ear that hears or the eye that reads this discourse, in order to discover in it, if they are pure, the speech of the truth, which inhabits each of its words in person. Need I add that once we have broken with the religious complicity between logos and being, between the great book that was, in its very being, the world, and the discourse of the knowledge of the world, between the essence of things and its reading, once we have broken those tacit pacts in which the men of a still fragile age secured themselves with magical alliances against the precariousness of history and the trembling of their own daring, need I add that Once we have broken these ties, a new conception of discourse at last becomes possible. Section 4. Returning to Marx, we note that not only in what he says, but in what he does, we can grasp the transition from an earlier idea and practice of reading to a new practice of reading and to a theory of history capable of providing us with a new theory of reading. When we read Marx, we immediately find a reader who reads to us, and out loud. The fact that Marx was a prodigious reader is much less important for us than the fact that Marx felt the need to fill out his text by reading out loud, not only for the pleasure of quotation or through scrupulousness in his references. His accuracy in this was fanatical, as his opponents learned to their cost. Not only because of the intellectual honesty which made him always and generously recognize his debts, a loss he knew that what a debt was, but for reasons deeply rooted in the theoretical conditions of his work of discovery. So Marx reads out loud to us, not only in the theories of surplus value, a book which remains essentially in note form, but also in capital. Marx reads Quinet, Marx reads Smith, Marx reads Ricardo, etc. Marx reads Ricardo, Smith, and Quinet, which seems a perfectly lucid way, in order to support himself with what is correct in what they say, and in order to criticize what is false in what they say. In sum, to situate himself with respect to the acknowledged masters of political economy. However, the reading Marx makes of Smith and Ricardo is only lucid for a certain reading of this reading. For an immediate reading that does not question what it reads, but takes the obvious in the text read for hard cash. In reality, Marx's reading of Smith-Ricardo, there will be my example here, is on looking at it closely, a rather special one. It is a double reading, or rather a reading which involves two radically different reading principles. In the first reading, Marx reads his predecessor's discourse, Smith's for instance, through his own discourse. The result of this reading through a grid in which Smith's text is seen through Marx's, projected onto it, is a measure of it, is merely a summary of concordances and discordances, the balance of what Smith discovered and what Smith missed, of his merits and failings, of his presences and absences. In fact, this reading is a retrospective theoretical reading, in which what Smith could not see or understand appears only as a radical omission. Certain of these omissions do refer to others, and the latter to a primary omission, but even this reduction restricts us to the observation of presences and absences. As for the omissions themselves, this reading does not provide reasons for them, since the observation of them destroys them. The continuity of Marx's discourse shows the lacunae in Smith's discourse, which are invisible to Smith beneath the apparent continuity of his discourse. Marx very often explains these omissions by Smith's distractions, or in the strict sense, his absences. He did not see what was, however, staring him in the face. Smith did not grasp what was, however, in his hands. Quote, oversights, end quote, all more or less related to the, quote, enormous oversight, end quote, the confusion of constant capital and variable capital, which dominates all classical economics, and its, quote, incredible, end quote, aberration. This reduces every weakness in the system of concepts that makes up knowledge to a psychological weakness of, quote, vision, end quote. And if it is absences of vision that explain these oversights, in the same way and by the same necessity, is the presence and acuteness of, quote, vision, end quote, which will explain these, quote, sightings, end quote. All the knowledge is recognized. This single logic of sighting and oversighting thus reveals itself to us as what it is, the logic of a conception of knowledge in which all the work of knowledge is reduced in principle to the recognition of the mere relation of vision, in which the whole nature of its object is reduced to the condition of a given. What Smith did not see through a weakness of vision, Marx sees. What Smith did not see was perfectly visible, and it was because it was visible that Smith could fail to see it, while Marx could see it. We are in a circle. We have relapsed into the mirror myth of knowledge as the vision of a given object of the reading of an established text, neither of which is ever anything but transparency itself. The blindness of blindness, belonging by right to vision as much as to the virtue of clear-sightedness to the human eye. but as one is always treated as one treats others, this reduces Marx to Smith minus the myopia. It reduces to nothing the whole gigantic effort by which Marx tore himself from Smith's supposed myopia. It reduces to a mere difference of vision, this day in which all cats are no longer gray. It reduces to nothing the historical distance and theoretical dislocation, in which Marx thinks the theoretical differences that nevertheless separates Marx from Smith forever. And finally, we too are condemned to the same fate of vision, condemned to see in Marx only what Marx saw. Section 5. If you're not following what's being said here, neither am I. But you gotta be unenlightened before you're enlightened. Or there'll be nothing to light. Alright, section 5. But there is in Marx a second, quite different reading, with nothing in common with the first, the latter which is only sustained by the dual and conjoint observation of presences and absences, of sights and oversights, can itself be blamed for a remarkable oversight. It does not see that the combined existence of sightings and oversights in an author poses a problem, the problem of their combination. It does not see this problem precisely because this problem is only visible insofar as it is invisible, because this problem concerns something quite different from given objects that can be seen so long as one's eyes are clear, a necessary invisible connection between the field of the visible and the field of the invisible, a connection which defines the necessity of the obscure field of the invisible as a necessary effect of the structure of the visible field. But in order to make what I mean by this more comprehensible, I shall leave this abrupt posing of the question in suspense for the moment and make a detour back to it through the analysis of the second kind of reading we find in Marx. I need only one example of the admirable chapter 19 of Capital on wages, secretly reflected backstage in Engels' extraordinary theoretical Marx in his preface to Volume 2. I therefore quote Marx, reader of the classical economists. Classical political economy borrowed the category, quote, price of labor, end quote, from everyday life without further criticism, and then simply asked the question, how is this price of labor determined? Classical political economy recognized that changes in the relation between supply and demand explain nothing with regard to the price of labor or any other commodity, except those changes themselves, i.e. the oscillation of the market price above or below a certain mean. If demand and supply balance, the oscillation of prices ceases, all their circumstances remaining the same. But then demand and supply also cease to explain anything. The price of equilibrium, at the moment when demand and supply are in equilibrium, is labor's natural price, determined independently of the relation of demand and supply. It was therefore found that the natural price was the object which actually had to be analyzed, or a longer period of oscillation in the market price was taken, for example a year, and the oscillations were found to cancel each other out, leaving a mean average quantity, a constant magnitude. This naturally had to be determined otherwise than by its own mutually compensatory variations. This price which ultimately predominates over the accidental market prices of labor and regulates them. This, quote, necessary price, end quote, according to the physiocrats, or, quote, natural price, end quote, according to Adam Smith, can only be its value expressed in money, as with all other commodities. Quote, the commodity, end quote, says Smith, quote, is then sold for precisely what it is worth, end quote. In this way, the political economists believed they could penetrate to the value of labor through the medium of the accidental price of labor. As with other commodities, this value is then further determined by the cost of production. But what is the cost of production? Of the worker, i.e. the cost of producing or reproducing the worker himself. The political economists unconsciously substitute this question for the original question. For the search after the cost of production of labor as such turned in a circle. It did not allow them to get any further forward at all. Therefore, what they called the, quote, value of labor, end quote, is in fact the value of labor power, as it exists in the personality of the worker, and it is a difference from its function. Labor, as a machine, is from the operations the machine performs. Because they were concerned with the difference between the market price of labor and labor's so-called value, with the relation of this value to the rate of profit and to the values of the commodities produced by means of labor, etc., they never discussed what the course of the analysis. They never discovered that the course of the analysis had led not only from the market prices of labor to labor's presumed value, but also to the resolution that this value of labor itself into the value of labor power. But also to the resolution of this value of labor itself into the value of labor power. Classical political economy's unconsciousness of this result of its own analysis and its uncritical acceptance of the categories, quote, value of labor, end quote, quote, natural price of labor, end quote, etc., as the ultimate and adequate expression for the value relations under consideration, led into inextricable confusions and contradictions, ... end quote. Volume 1, pages 677 to 679. Translation modified after the French edition. So, end quote. I take this astonishing text for what it is, a protocol of Marx's reading of classical economics. Here again it is tempting to believe that we are destined to a conception of reading which adds up the balance of citings and oversights. Classical political economy certainly saw that ... but classical political economy did not see that ... Classical political economy, quote, never arrived at, end quote, a sight of ... Here again it seems as if this balance of sights and oversights is found beneath a grid, the classical absences revealed by the Marxist presences. But there is one very small difference which I warn the reader straight away we have no intention of not seeing. It is this. What classical political economy does not see is not what classical political economy does not see. What classical political economy does not see is what classical political economy sees. It is not what it lacks. On the contrary, it is what it does not lack. It's not what it misses. On the contrary, it is what it does not miss. The oversight, then, is not to see what one sees. The oversight no longer concerns the object, but the sight itself. The oversight is an oversight that concerns vision. Non-vision is therefore inside vision. Non-vision is a form of vision and hence has a necessary relationship with vision. We have reached our real problem, the problem that exists in, and is posed by the actual identity of this organic confusion of non-vision in vision, or rather, in this observation of non-vision or of oversight, we are no longer dealing with a reading of classical economics through the grid of Marxist theory alone, with a comparison between classical theory and Marxist theory, the latter providing the standard. For we never compare classical theory with anything except classical theory's self, classical theory's non-vision with classical theory's vision. We are therefore dealing with our problem in our problem's pure state, defined in a single domain, without any regression to infinity. To understand this necessary and paradoxical identity of non-vision and vision within vision itself is very exactly to pose our problem, the problem of the necessary connection between which unites the visible and the invisible, and to pose it properly is to give ourselves a chance of solving it. Okay. Section 6. How, therefore, is this identity of non-vision and vision in vision possible? Let us reread our text carefully. In the course of the questions classical economics asked about the, quote, value of labor, end quote, something very special has happened. Classical political economy, quote, produced, end quote, just as Engels will say in the preface to Volume 2, that phlogistic chemistry, quote, produced, end quote, oxygen, and classical economics, quote, produced, end quote, surplus value. A correct answer, the value of, quote, labor, end quote, is equal to the value of the subsistence goods necessary for the reproduction of, quote, labor, end quote. A correct answer is a correct answer. Any reader in the first manner will give Smith and Ricardo a good mark and pass on to other observations. Not Marx, for what we shall call his eye has been attracted by a remarkable property of this answer. It is the correct answer to a question that has just one failing. It was never posed. The original question as the classical economic text formulated it was, what is the value of labor? Reduced to the content that can be rigorously defended in the text where classical economics produced it, the answer should be written as follows, quote, the value of labor, is equal to the value of the subsistence goods necessary for the maintenance of and reproduction of labor, end quote. These are two blanks, two absences in the text of the answer. Thus Marx makes us see blanks in the text of classical economics answer. But that is merely to make us see that the classical text itself, what the classical text itself says while not saying it, but does not say while saying it. Hence it is not Marx who says that the classical text does not say. Hence it's not Marx who says what the classical text does not say. It is not Marx who intervenes to impose from without on the classical text a discourse which reveals its silence. It is the classical text itself which tells us that it is silent. It is the classical text itself which tells us that it is silent. The classical text silence is its own words. Its own words. In fact, if we suppress our, quote, suspension points, end quote, our blanks, we still have the same discourse, the same apparently, quote, full, end quote, sentence, quote, the value of labor is equal to the value of the subsistence goods necessary for the maintenance and reproduction of labor, end quote. But this sentence means nothing. What is the maintenance of, quote, labor, end quote? What is the reproduction of, quote, labor? The substitution of one word for another at the end of the answer, quote, laborer, end quote, for, quote, labor, end quote, might seem to settle the question. Quote, the value of labor is equal to the value of the subsistence goods necessary for the maintenance and reproduction of the laborer, end quote. But as the labor is not the labor, the term at the end of the sentence now clashes with the term at the beginning. They do not have the same content and the equation cannot be made, for it is not the laborer who is bought for the wages, but his, quote, labor, end quote. And how are we to situate the first labor and the second term, quote, labor? In even uttering this sentence, therefore, precisely at the level of the term, quote, labor, end quote, at the beginning and end of the answer, there's something lacking, and this lack is strictly designated by the function of the terms themselves in the whole sentence. If we suppress our suspension points, our blanks, we are merely reconstituting a sentence which, if it is taken literally, itself designates in itself these points of emptiness, restores these suspension points as the marks of an omission produced by the, quote, fullness, end quote, of the utterance itself. This omission, located by the answer, in the answer itself, immediately next to the word, quote, labor, is no more than the presence in the answer of the absence of its question, the omission of its question. For the question posed does not seem to contain anything by which to locate locate in it this omission. Quote, "What is the value of labor," end quote, is a sentence identical to a concept. It is a concept sentence which is content to utter the concept, quote, "value of labor," end quote. An utterance sentence which does not designate any omission in itself, unless it is itself as a whole, as a concept, a question manqué, a concept manqué, the omission manque of a concept. It is the answer that answers us about the question. Since the question's only space is this very concept of, quote, labor, end quote, which is designated by the answer as the site of the omission, it is the answer that tells us that the question is its own omission and nothing else. If the answer, including its omissions, is correct, and if its question is merely the omission of its concept, it is because the answer is the answer to a different question, which has the peculiarity of not having been uttered in the suspension points of the answer, precisely in the answer's suspension points. That is why Marx can write, quote, "The result the analysis led to, therefore, was not a resolution of the problem as the problem emerged at the beginning, but a complete change in the terms of the problem," end quote. Marx. That is why Marx composed the unuttered question simply by uttering the concept present in an unuttered form in the emptiness in the answer, sufficiently present in this answer to produce and reveal these emptinesses as the emptinesses of a presence. Marx re-establishes the continuity of the utterance by introducing / re-establishing in the utterance the concept of labor power, present in the emptiness and the utterance of classical political economy's answer, and at the same time is establishing / re-establishing the continuity of the answer. By the utterance of the concept of labor power, he produces the as yet unposed question, which the as yet unasked for answer answered. The answer then becomes, quote, "The value of labor power is equal to the value of the subsistence goods necessary for the maintenance and reproduction of labor power," end quote. And the answer's question is produced as follows, quote, "What is the value of labor power?" end quote. This restoration of an utterance containing emptiness and this production of its question out of the answer enable us to bring to light the reasons why classical economics was blind to what it nevertheless saw, and thus to explain the non-vision inside its vision. Moreover, it is clear that the mechanism whereby Marx is able to see what classical economics did not see while seeing it is identical with the mechanism whereby Marx sees what classical economics did not see at all, and also, at least in principle, identical with the mechanism whereby we are at this moment reflecting this operation of the sighting of a non-sight of the scene by reading a text by Marx, which is itself a reading of a text of classical economics. New section, section 7. We have now reached a point we had to reach in order to discover from it the reason for this oversight, where a sighting is concerned. We must completely reorganize the idea we have of knowledge. We must abandon the mirror myths of immediate vision and reading and conceive knowledge as a production. What made the mistake of political economy possible does indeed affect the transformation of political economy's object. What made the mistake of political economy possible does indeed affect the transformation of the object. The transformation of the object of political economy's oversight. What political economy does not see is not a pre-existing object, which political economy could have seen but did not see, but an object which political economy produced itself. in political economy's operation of knowledge, and which did not pre-exist political economy, precisely the production itself, which is identical with the object. What political economy does not see is what political economy does. Political economy's production of a new answer without a question, and simultaneously the production of a new latent question contained in relief in this new answer. Through the illusionary terms of political economy's new answer, political economy produced a new question, but, quote, unconsciously, end quote. Political economy made, quote, a complete change in the terms of the original problem, end quote, and thereby produced a new problem, but without knowing it. Far from knowing it, it remained convinced that it was still in the terrain of the old problem. Whereas it, quote, unconsciously changed terrain, end quote. Its blindness and its, quote, oversight, end quote, lie in this misunderstanding between what it produces and what it sees, in this, quote, substitution, end quote, which Marx elsewhere calls a, quote, play on words, end quote, Wortspiel, that is necessarily impenetrable for its author. Why is political economy necessarily blind to what political economy produces and to political economy's work of production? Because political economy's eyes are still fixed on the old question. And political economy continues to relate political economy's new answer to political economy's old question. Because political economy is still concentrating on the, quote, on the old, quote, horizon, end quote, within which the new problem, quote, is invisible, end quote. Capital Volume 1, page 680. Thus the metaphors in which Marx thinks this necessary, quote, substitution, end quote, suggest the image of a change of terrain and a corresponding change of horizon. They raise a crucial point which enables us to escape from the psychological reduction of the, quote, oversight, end quote, or unconscious. In fact, what is at stake in the production of this new problem contained unconsciously in the new answer is not a particular new object which has emerged among others, already identified objects, like an unexpected guest at a family reunion. On the contrary, what has happened involves a transformation of the entire terrain, of its entire horizon, which are the background against which the new problem is produced. The emergence of this new critical problem is merely a particular index of a possible critical transformation and of a possible latent mutation which affect the reality of this terrain throughout its extent, including the extreme limits of its, quote, horizon, end quote. Putting this fact in the language I have already used, footnote, Louis Althusser for Marx, the production of a new problem endowed with this critical character, critical in the sense of a critical situation, is the unstable index of the possible production of a new theoretical problematic, of which this problem is only a symptomatic mode. Engels says this luminously in his preface to Volume 2 of Capital. The mere, quote, production, end quote, of oxygen by phlogistic chemistry, or of surplus value by classical economics, contains the wherewithal not only to modify the old theory at one point, but also to, quote, revolutionize all economics, end quote, or all chemistry. Hence, what is in balance in this unstable and apparently local event is the possibility of a revolution in the old theory, and hence in the old problematic, as a totality. This introduces us to a fact peculiar to the very existence of science. Science can only pose problems on the terrain and within the horizon of a definite theoretical structure. Science is problematic, which constitutes science's absolute and definite condition of possibility, and hence the absolute determination of the forms in which all problems must be posed at any given moment in the science. Footnote: Auguste Comte often came very close to this idea. This opens the way to an understanding of the determination of the visible as visible, and conjointly of the invisible as invisible, and of the organic link binding the invisible to the visible. Any object or problem situated on the terrain and within the horizon, i.e., in the definite structured field of the theoretical problematic of a given theoretical discipline, is visible. We must take these words literally. The citing is thus no longer the act of an individual subject, endowed with the faculty of, quote, vision, end quote, which he exercises either attentively or distractedly. The citing is the act of its structural conditions, is the relation of immanent reflection between the field of problematic and its objects and its problems. Footnote, quote, relation of immanent reflection, end quote. This, quote, reflection, end quote, itself poses a theoretical problem which I cannot deal with here, but which will be outlined at the end of this introduction. End footnote. Vision then loses the religious privileges of divine reading. Vision is no more than a reflection of the immanent necessity that ties an object or problem to its conditions of existence, which lie in the conditions of its production. It is literally no longer the eye, the mind's eye of a subject which sees what exists in the field defined by a theoretical problematic. It is this field itself which sees itself in the objects or problems it defines, citing being merely the necessary reflection of the field on its objects. This no doubt explains a, quote, substitution, end quote, in the classical philosophies of vision, which are very embarrassing by having to say both that the light of vision This no doubt explains a, quote, substitution, end quote, in the classical philosophies of vision, which are very embarrassed by having to say both that the light of vision comes from the eye and it comes from the object. The same connection that defines the visible also defines the invisible as its shadowy obverse. It is the field of the problematic that defines and structures the individual as the defined excluded from the field of visibility, and defined as excluded by the existence and peculiar structure of the field of the problematic, as what forbids and represses the reflection of the field on its object, i.e. the necessary and immanent interrelationship of the problematic and one of its objects. This is the case with oxygen in the phlogistic theory of chemistry, or with surplus value and the definition of the, quote, value of labor, end quote, in classical economics. These new objects and problems are necessarily invisible in the field of the existing theory, because these new objects and problems are not objects of this field of existing theory. Because these new objects and problems are forbidden by this theory. These new objects and problems are objects and problems necessarily without any necessary relation with the field of the visible as defined by this problematic. These new objects and problems are invisible because these new objects and problems are rejected in principle, repressed from the field of the visible. That is why their fleeting presence in the field, when it does occur, in very peculiar and symptomatic circumstances, goes unperceived and becomes literally an undivulgeable absence, since the whole function of the field is not to see them, to forbid any sighting of them. Here again, the invisible is no more a function of a subject sighting. Here again, the invisible is no more a function of a subject sighting than is the visible. The invisible is the theoretical problematic's non-vision of the theoretical problematic's non-objects. The invisible is the darkness, the blinded eye of the theoretical problematic's self-reflection when it scans its non-objects, its non-problems without seeing them, in order not to look at them. And since it uses terms adopted from some very remarkable passages in the preface of Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, We have evoked the conditions of possibility of the visible and the invisible, of the inside and the outside of the theoretical field that defines the visible. Perhaps we can go one step further and show that a certain relation of necessity may exist between the visible and the invisible thus defined. In the development of a theory, the invisible of a visible field is not generally anything whatever, outside and foreign to the visible defined by that field. The invisible is defined by the visible as it's invisible, as the visible's forbidden vision. The invisible is not, therefore, simply what is outside the visible. To return to the spatial metaphor, the outer darkness of exclusion, but the inner darkness of exclusion, inside the visible itself, because defined by its structure. In other words, the seductive metaphors of the terrain, the horizon, and hence the limits of a visible field defined by a given problematic, threaten to induce a false idea of the nature of this field, if we think this field literally according to the spatial metaphor, as a space limited by another space outside it. Footnote. The recourse made in this text to spatial metaphors, field, terrain, space, site, situation, position, poses a theoretical problem, the problem of the validity of its claim to existence in a discourse with scientific pretensions. The problem may be formulated as follows. Why does a certain form of scientific discourse necessarily need the use of metaphors borrowed from non-scientific disciplines? End footnote. The other space is also in the first space, which contains it as its own denigration. This other space is the first space in person, which is only defined by the denigration of what it excludes from its own limits. In other words, all its limits are internal. It carries its outside inside it. Hence, if we wish to preserve the spatial metaphor, the paradox of the theoretical field is that it is an infinite because definite space. It has no limits, no external frontiers separating the theoretical field from nothing, precisely because it is defined and limited within itself, carrying in itself the finitude of its definition, which by excluding what it is not, makes it what it is. Its definition, a scientific operation par excellence, then, is what makes it both infinite in its kind, and marked inside itself, in all its determinations, by what is excluded from it in it, by its very definition. And when it happens that, in certain very special critical circumstances, the development of the questions produced by the problematic, in the present case, the development of the questions of political economy, investigating the, quote, the value of labor, end quote, leads to the production of the fleeting presence of an aspect. The production of the fleeting presence of an aspect of its invisible within the visible field of the existing problematic. This product can then only be invisible, since the light of the field scans it blindly without reflecting on it. This invisible thus disappears as a theoretical lapse, absence, lack of symptom. It manifests itself exactly as it is, invisible to theory, and that is why Smith made his, quote, oversight, end quote. To see this invisible, to see these, quote, oversights, end quote, to identify the lacunae in the fullness of this discourse, the blanks in the crowded text, we need something quite different from an acute or attentive gaze. We need an informed gaze, a new gaze, itself produced by a reflection of the, quote, change of terrain, end quote, on the exercise of vision, in which Marx pictures the transformation of the problematic. Here we take this transformation for a fact, without any claim to analyze the mechanism that unleashed it and completed it. The fact that this, quote, change of terrain, end quote, which produces as its effect this metamorphosis in the gaze, was itself only produced in very specific, complex, and often dramatic conditions. That is absolutely irreducible to the idealist myth of a mental decision to change, quote, viewpoints, end quote, that it brings into play a whole process that the subject's citing far from producing, merely reflects in its own place. That in this process of real transformation of the means of production of knowledge, the claims of a, quote, constitutive subject, end quote, are as vain as are the claims of the subject of vision, in the production of the invisible, that the whole process takes place in the dialectical crisis of the mutation of a theoretical structure in which the, quote, subject, end quote, plays, not the part the, quote, not the part it believes it is playing, but the part which is assigned to it by the mechanism of the process. All these are questions that cannot be studied here. It is enough to remember that the subject must have occupied its new place in the new terrain. In other words, that the subject must already, even partly unwittingly, have been installed in this new terrain for it to be possible to apply to the old invisible, the informed gaze that will make that invisible visible. Marx can see what escaped Smith's gaze, because Marx has already occupied this new terrain, which in what new answers it had produced, had nevertheless been produced, though unwittingly, by the old problematic. New section, section 8. Such is Marx's second reading, a reading which we might well be called, quote, symptomatic, end quote, insofar as it divulges the undivulged event in the text it reads, and in the same movement relates it to a different text, present as a necessary absence in the first. Like his first reading, Marx's second reading presupposes the existence of two texts, and the measurement of the first against the second. But what distinguishes this new reading from the old one is the fact that in the new one, the second text is articulated with the lapses in the first text. Here again, at least in the way peculiar to theoretical texts, the only ones whose analysis is at issue here, we found the necessity and possibility of a reading on two bearings simultaneously. In the papers you are about to read, and which do not escape the law I have pronounced, assuming that they have some claim to be treated, for the time being at least, as discourses with a theoretical meaning, we have simply tried to apply to Marx's reading the, quote, symptomatic, end quote, reading, with which Marx managed to read the illegible in Smith, by measuring the problematic initially visible in his writings against the invisible problematic contained in the paradox of an answer which does not correspond to any question posed. An answer which does not correspond to any question posed. You'll also find that the infinite distance which separates Marx from Smith, and in consequence our relation to Marx from Marx's relation to Smith, is the following radical difference. Whereas in his text Smith produces an answer which not only does not answer any of the immediately preceding questions, but does not even answer any other question Smith ever posed anywhere in his work. With Marx, on the contrary, when he does happen to formulate an answer without a question, with a little patience and perspicacity, we can find the question itself elsewhere, 20 or 100 pages further on, with respect to some other object, enveloped in some other matter, or on occasion in Engels' immediate comments on Marx, for Engels has flashes of profound inspiration. Footnote: if I may invoke my personal experience, I should like to give two precise examples of the presence elsewhere in Marx or in Engels of the question's absence from its answer, at the cost of a decidedly laborious investigation, the text of which, for Marx, bears the mark of these difficulties. I succeeded in identifying a pertinent absence in the idea of the, quote, inversion, end quote, of the Hegelian dialectic by Marx. The absence of its concept and therefore of its question. I managed to reconstruct this question laboriously by showing that the, quote, inversion, end quote, Marx mentions has as its effective content a revolution in the problematic. But later, reading Engels' preface to Volume 2 of Capital, I was stupefied to find that the question I had such trouble in formulating was there in black and white. Engels expressly identifies the, quote, inversion, end quote, the, quote, setting right side up again, end quote, of the chemistry and political economy which have been standing on their heads, with a change in their, quote, theory, end quote, and therefore in their problematic. Or again, in one of my first essays, I suggested that Marx's theoretical revolution lay not in his change of the answers, but in his change of the questions, and that therefore Marxist revolution in the theory of history consisted of a, quote, change of elements, end quote, by which he moved from the terrain of ideology to the terrain of science. But recently, reading the chapter of Capital and Wages, I was stupefied to see that Marx used the very expression, quote, change of terrain, end quote, to express this change of theoretical problematic. Here again the question, or its concept, which I laboriously reconstituted out of its absence in one precise point of Marx's, Marx himself gave in black and white somewhere else in his work. End footnote. And if, as I have dared suggest, there is undoubtedly in Marx an important answer to a question that is nowhere posed, an answer which Marx only succeeds in formulating on condition of multiplying the images required to render it, the answer of the, quote, Darstellung, end quote, and its avatars, it is surely because the age Marx lived in did not provide him, and could not acquire in his lifetime, an adequate concept with which to think what he produced. The concept of the effectivity of a structure on its elements. The concept of the effectivity of a structure on that structure's elements. It will no doubt be said that this is merely a word, and that only the word is missing, since the object of the word is there complete. Certainly, but this word is a concept, and the repercussions of the structural lack of this concept can be found in certain precise theoretical effects on certain assignable forms of Marx's discourse, and in certain of Marx's identifiable formulations, which are not without their consequences, which may help to illuminate, but this time from within, i.e., not as a relic of a past, a survival, a raffish, quote, flirtation, end quote, the famous coquettieren, or trap for fools. Quote, the advantage of my dialectic is that I say things little by little, and when they think I have finished and rush to refute me, they merely make an untimely manifestation of their asininity, end quote. Marx letter to Engels, 27th of June, 1867. The real presence of certain Hegelian forms and references in the discourse of Capital, the book, from within, as the exact measurement of a disconcerting but inevitable absence, the absence of the concept and all the sub-concepts of the effectivity of a structure on that structure's elements, which is the visible/invisible, absent/present keystone of his whole work. Perhaps, therefore, it is not impermissible to think that if Marx does, quote, play, end quote, so much with Hegelian formulae in certain passages, the game is not just raffishness or sarcasm, but the action of a real drama, in which old concepts desperately play the part of something absent which is nameless, in order to call it onto the stage in person, whereas they only, quote, produce, end quote, its presence in their failures, in the dislocation between the characters and their roles. If it is true that the identification and location of this omission, which is a philosophical omission, can also lead us to the threshold of Marx's philosophy, we can hope for other gains from it in the theory of history itself. A conceptual omission that has not been divulged, but on the contrary consecrated as a non-omission and proclaimed as a fullness, may in certain circumstances seriously hinder the development of a science or a certain of its branches. To be convinced of this, we need only note that a science only progresses, i.e. lives, by the extreme attention it pays to the points where it is theoretically fragile. By these standards, it depends less for its life on what it knows than on what it does not know. Its absolute precondition is to focus on this unknown and to pose this unknown in the rigor of a problem. But the unknown of a science is not what empiricist ideology thinks. It's, quote, residue, end quote, what it leaves out, what it cannot conceive or resolve, but par excellence, what it contains that is fragile despite its apparently unquestionable, quote, obviousness, end quote. Certain silences in its discourse, certain conceptual omissions and lapses in its rigor. In brief, everything in it that, quote, sounds hollow, end quote, in an all attentive ear, despite its fullness. If it is true that a science progresses and lives by knowing how to hear what, quote, sounds hollow, end quote, in that science, some part of the life of the Marxist theory of history perhaps depends on this precise point, where Marx shows us in 1,000 ways the presence of a concept essential to his thought, but absent from his discourse. This then is the guilt of our philosophical reading of Capital. It reads Marx according to the rules of a reading in which he gave us a brilliant lesson in his own reading of classical political economy. Our admission of this crime is deliberate. We shall fetter ourselves to it, anchor ourselves in it, cling fiercely to it as the point which must be hung onto at all costs if we hope to establish ourselves on it one day. Recognizing the infinite extent contained within its minute space, the extent of Marx's philosophy. We are all seeking this philosophy. The protocols of the German ideology's philosophical rupture do not give us it in person, nor do the earlier theses on Feuerbach, whose few lightning flashes which break the night of philosophical anthropology with the fleeting snap of a new world glimpse through the retinal image of the old, nor finally, at least insofar as their immediate form is concerned, however brilliant their clinical judgment, do the criticisms in Anti-Düring, where Engels had to, quote, follow Herr Düring into that vast territory in which he dealt with all things under the sun and some others as well, end quote. The territory of philosophical ideology, or of a world outlook described in the form of a, quote, system, end quote. For to think that all Marxist philosophy can be found in the few quivering sentences of the theses on Feuerbach, i.e., in the works of the break, is to deceive oneself remarkably as to the conditions indispensable to the growth of a radically new theory which needs time to mature, define itself, and grow. Quote, after its presentation to the world in Marx's Poverty of Philosophy and in the Communist Manifesto, end quote, writes Engels, quote, this mode of outlook of ours, passed through an incubation period of fully 20 years before the publication of Capital, end quote. Similarly, to believe that we can get all Marxist philosophy directly from the polemical formulations of a work that joins battle on the enemy's terrain, i.e. on the terrain of philosophical ideology, as Anti-Düring very often does, and imperial criticism does later, is to deceive ourselves as to the laws of ideological struggle, as to the struggle of the ideology, which is the stage on which this indispensable struggle is fought, and as to the necessary distinction between the philosophical ideology in which this ideological struggle is fought and the theory or Marxist philosophy which appears on this stage to give battle there. To concentrate exclusively on the works of the break or on the arguments of the later ideological struggle is in practice to fall into the, quote, oversight, end quote, of not seeing the place we are given in which to read Marxist philosophy in person is par excellence his masterpiece, Capital. But we have known this for a long time, since Engels, who told us in black and white, particularly in the extraordinary preface to Capital Volume 2, which will be a school text someday, since Lenin, who repeated that Marxist philosophy was entirely to be found in the, quote, logic of capital, end quote, the logic Marx, quote, did not have time, end quote, to write. Let no one argue against this, that we are living in a different century, that much water has flowed under the bridge and that our problems are no longer the same. We are discussing living water which has not yet flowed away. We are familiar with enough historical examples, beginning with that of Spinoza, where men have worked ferociously to wall up forever and bury deep in the earth sources which were made to quench their thirst, but which their fear will not tolerate. For nearly a century, academic philosophy has buried Marx in the earth of silence, the earth of the cemetery. In the same period, Marx's comrades and successors had to contend with the most dramatic and urgent struggles, and Marx's philosophy passed completely into their historical enterprises, their economic, political, and ideological action, and into the indispensable works that guided and instructed that action. In this long period of struggles, the idea of Marx's philosophy, the consciousness of Marxist philosophy's specific existence and function, which are indispensable to the purity and rigor of the knowledge that underlay all action, were safeguarded and defended against all temptations and hostility. I need no other proof of this than that cry of scientific conscience, materialism and imperial criticism, and all of Lenin's work, that permanent revolutionary manifesto for knowledge, for scientific theory, for, quote, partisanship in philosophy, end quote, the principle that dominates everything, and is nothing but the most acute consciousness of scientificity in its lucid and intransigent rigor. This is what we have been given, and what defines our task today, a number of works, some produced by the theoretical practice of a science, with capital at the top of the list, the others produced by economic and political practice, all the transformations that the history of the workers' movement has imposed on the world, or by reflection on this practice, the economic, political, and ideological texts of the great Marxists. These works carry with them not only the Marxist theory of history, contained in the theory of the capitalist mode of production and in all the fruits of revolutionary action, but also Marx's philosophical theory, in which they are thoroughly steeped, though sometimes unwittingly, even in the inevitable approximations of its practical expression. Once before, in For Marx, I claimed that it was necessary to give to this practical existence of Marxist philosophy, which exists in persons in the practical state, in that scientific practice of the analysis of the capitalist mode of production, capital, and in the economic and practical space of the history of the workers' movement, the form of theoretical existence indispensable to its needs and our needs. I merely proposed a labor of investigation and critical elucidation, which would analyze one with another according to the nature of their peculiar modalities, the different degrees of this existence, i.e. the different works, which are the raw material of our reflection. I merely proposed a, quote, symptomatic, end quote, reading of the works of Marx and of Marxism, one with another, i.e. the progressive and systematic production of a reflection of the problematic on its objects such as to make them visible, and the illumination, the production of the deepest lying problematic which will allow us to see what could otherwise only have existed elusively or practically. As a function of this demand, I can claim to have read the specific theoretical form of the Marxist dialectic in the Marxist dialectic's directly political existence and actively political, the policies of a revolutionary leader, Lenin, immersed in the revolution. As a function of this principle, I can claim to have treated Mao Zedong's 1937 text on contradiction as the description of the structures of the Marxist dialectic reflected in political practice. But this reading was not, nor could have been, a direct reading of the merely, quote, generalizing, end quote, reading, which Marxist philosophy is too often reduced to, but which, beneath the word abstraction, with which it is covered, is no more than the confirmation of the religious or empiricist myth of reading, for the summation of individual readings that it resumed does not for one moment deliver us from this myth. This reading was in principle a dual reading, the first of a different, quote, symptomatic, end quote, reading, which introduces into a question an answer given to its absent question. To speak plainly, it is only possible to pose to the practical political analyses Lenin gives us of the conditions of the revolutionary explosion of 1917, the question of the specificity of the Marxist dialectic on the basis of an answer which lacked the proximity of its question, an answer situated at another place in Marx's works at our disposal, precisely the answer in which Marx declared that he had, quote, inverted, end quote, the Hegelian dialectic. This answer by, quote, inversion, end quote, was Marx's answer to the following absent question: what is the specific difference distinguishing the Marxist dialectic from the Hegelian dialectic? But this answer by, quote, inversion, end quote, late classical political economy's answer by the, quote, value of labor, end quote, is noteworthy in that it contains inside it an internal lack. An interrogation of the inversion metaphor shows that it cannot itself think itself, and hence that it both points to a real but absent problem, a real but absent question outside itself, and to the conceptual emptiness or ambiguity corresponding to this absence, the absence of a concept behind a word. Treating this absence of a concept behind a word, treating this absence of the concept beneath the presence of a word as a symptom put me onto the track of the formation of the question implied and defined by the absence of this concept, by this concept's absence. However imperfect and provisional it may have been, my, quote, reading, end quote, of Lenin's text was only possible on condition that it posed these texts, the theoretical question whose active answer they represented, although their level of existence was far from purely theoretical, since these texts describe, for practical purposes, the structure of the conjuncture in which the Soviet Revolution exploded. This, quote, reading, end quote, enabled me to sharpen the question and then to pose the question thus transformed to other equally symptomatic texts existing at different levels, to Mao Zedong's text, and also to the methodological text like Marx's 1857 introduction. The question forged out of the first answer emerged, transformed anew, and suitable for a reading of other works, today capital. But here again, to read capital, we have resorted to a series of dual, i.e., quote, symptomatic, end quote, readings. We have read capital in order to make visible whatever invisible survivals there are in it, but in the present state of our forces, the backward step necessary for this, quote, reading has taken all the space we could obtain for it from a second reading performed simultaneously of Marx's early works, in particular the 1844 manuscripts, and therefore of the problematic which constitutes the background to his works, Feuerbach's anthropological problematic and Hegel's problematic of absolute idealism. If the question of Marx's philosophy, i.e. of Marx's philosophy's differential specificity, emerges even only slightly altered and sharpened from this first reading of Capital, it should make other, quote, readings, end quote, possible. First, other readings of Capital, which will give rise to a new differential sharpenings, and then readings of other Marxist works. For example, an informed reading of Marxist texts which are philosophical, but trapped in the inevitable forms of ideological struggle, such as Engels' Anti-During and Dialectics of Nature, and Lenin's Materialism and Empiriocriticism, and his philosophical notebooks, or again a, quote, reading, end quote, of those other practical works of Marxism which are so abundant today and exist in the historical reality of socialism and of the newly liberated countries advancing toward socialism. I've deliberately left these classical philosophical texts so late for the simple reason that, before the definition of the essential principles of Marxist philosophy, i.e., before managing to establish the indispensable minimum for the consistent existence of Marxist philosophy and its difference from all philosophical ideology, it was not possible to read these classical texts, which are not scholarly but militant texts, other than to the enigmatic letter of their ideological expression, without being able to show why this expression had necessarily to take the form of ideological expression, i.e., being able to isolate this form in its real essence. The same is true for the, quote, reading, end quote, of the still theoretically opaque works on the history of the workers' movement, such as the, quote, cult of personality, end quote, or a very serious conflict of this kind which is our present drama. Perhaps this, quote, reading, end quote, will one day be possible on condition that we have correctly identified in the rational works of Marxism the resources for the production of the concepts indispensable to an understanding of the reasons for this unreason. Footnote. The same applies to the, quote, reading, end quote, of those new works of Marxism, which sometimes in surprising forms contain in them something essential to the future of socialism. What Marxism is producing in the vanguard countries of the, quote, third world, end quote, which is struggling for its freedom, from the guerrillas of Vietnam to Cuba, it is vital that we be able to, quote, read, end quote, these works before it is too late. End footnote. May I sum up all this in one sentence? This sentence describes a circle. A philosophical reading of Capital is only possible as the application of that which is the very object of our investigation, Marxist philosophy. This circle is only epistemologically possible because of the existence of Marxist philosophy in the works of Marxism. It is therefore a question of producing, in the precise sense of the word, which seems to signify making manifest what is latent, but which really means transforming, in order to give a pre-existing raw material the form of an object, adapted to an end, something which in a sense already exists. This production, in the double sense which gives the production operation the necessary form of a circle, is the production of a knowledge. To conceive Marxist philosophy and specificity is therefore to conceive the essence of the very movement with which the knowledge of it is produced, or to conceive knowledge as production. Section 10. There can be no question here of making any other claims than to take theoretical bearings on what we attain from our reading of Capital. Just as these papers are only a first reading, from which it must now surely be clear why we have presented them precisely in their hesitant form. So the specifications in this paper are merely the first strokes in a drawing which can as yet be no more than a sketch. One point of principle has, I think, been established. If there are no innocent readings, this is because every reading merely reflects in its lessons and rules the real culprit. The conception of knowledge underlying the object of knowledge which makes knowledge what it is. We have glimpsed this with respect to the, quote, expressive, end quote, reading, the open and ingenious reading of the essence in the existence, and behind this total ingenious reading of the essence, and behind this total presence, we have glimpsed this with respect to the, quote, expressive reading, the open and ingenious reading of the essence in the existence, and behind this total presence in which all opacity is reduced to nothing, we have suspected the existence of the darkness of the religious phantasm of epiphanic transparency and his privileged model of anchorage, the Logos and its scriptures. Our rejection of the confronting fascinations of this myth has informed us of another link, which must necessarily articulate the new reading Marx proposes to a new conception of knowledge on which it is based. But I must ask the reader's indulgence for another detour, in order to approach this from the best angle, without wishing to think within the same conceptions of knowledge whose historical relationship has not even been examined, let alone proved. I must nevertheless compare the conception which underlies the prescribed religious reading with another just as lively conception, and one which to all appearances is secular transcription. The empiricist conception of knowledge. I use this term in its widest sense since it can embrace a rationalist empiricism as well as a sensualist empiricism, and it is even found at work in Hegelian thought itself, which in principle, and with Hegel's own approval, can be regarded in this respect as the reconciliation of religion and its secular, quote, truth, end quote. Footnote. So long as empiricism is understood in this generic sense, it is possible to accept the inclusion within the concept of empiricism of the sensualist empiricism of the 18th century. If the latter does not always realize knowledge in its real object in the way I am about to describe, if from a certain standpoint it thinks knowledge as the product of a history, it realizes knowledge in the reality of a history which is merely the development of what it originally contains. By this standard, what I'm about to say about the structure of the real relationship between knowledge and its real object is equally valid for the relationship between knowledge and real history in 18th century ideology. End footnote. The empiricist conception of knowledge resurrects the myth we have encountered in a very special form. To understand this correctly, we must define the essential principle of the theoretical problematic which underlies it. The empiricist conception of knowledge presents a process that takes place between a given object and a given subject. At this level, the status of this subject, psychological, historical, or otherwise, and of this object, discontinuous or continuous, mobile or fixed, is not very important. This state only affects the precise definition of the variance of the basic problematic, while the basic problematic itself is all that concerns us here. The subject and object, which are given and hence predate the process of knowledge, already define a certain fundamental theoretical field, but one which cannot yet in this state be pronounced empiricist. What defines it as such is the nature of the process of knowledge. In other words, a certain relationship that defines knowledge as such, as a function of the real object of which it is said to be the knowledge. The whole empiricist process of knowledge lies in in an operation of the subject called abstraction. To know is to abstract from the real object its essence, the possession of which by the subject is then called knowledge. Whatever particular variance this concept of abstraction may adopt, it defines an invariant structure which constitutes the specific index of empiricism. Empiricist abstraction, which abstracts from the given real and empiricist abstraction, which abstracts from the given real object, its essence, is a real abstraction, leaving the subject in possession of the real essence. We shall see that this repetition at every moment of the process of the category real is characteristic of the empiricist conception. What does a real abstraction actually mean? It accounts for what is declared to be a real fact. The essence is abstracted from real objects in the sense of an extraction, as one might say that gold is extracted, or abstracted, i.e. separated, from the dross of earth and sand in which it is held and contained. Just as gold before gold's abstraction exists as gold unseparated from its dross and the dross itself, so the essence of the real existence as a real essence in the real which contains it. Knowledge is an abstraction in the strict sense, i.e., an extraction of the essence from the real which contains it, a separation of the essence from the real which contains it and keeps it in hiding. The procedure that makes this extraction possible, e.g. the comparison of objects, their mutual titration to wear away the dross, etc., is of little importance. The pattern of the real, whether it is composed of discrete individuals, each in its diversity containing a single essence, or a unique individual, is of little importance. In every case, this separation in the real itself of the essence of the real from the dross that conceals the essence imposes a very special representation both of the real and of the knowledge of it as the very condition of this operation. The real, it is structured as a dross of earth containing inside it a grain of pure gold, i.e., it is made of two real essences, the pure essence and the impure essence, the gold and the dross, or, if you like, Hegelian terms, the essential and the inessential. The inessential may be the form of individuality. This fruit, these particular fruits, or materiality, that is, which is not, quote, form, end quote, or essence, or, quote, nothingness, end quote, or anything else. It is unimportant. The fact is that the real object contains in it, really, two distinct real parts, the essence and the inessential, which gives us our first result. Knowledge, which is merely the essential essence, is really contained in the real as one of its parts, in the other part of the real, the inessential part. Knowledge, its sole function is to separate, in the object, the two parts which exist in it, the essential and the inessential, by special procedures whose aim is to eliminate the inessential real by a whole series of sortings, sievings, scrappings, and rubbings, and to leave the knowledge subject only the second part of the real, which is its essence, its self-real, which gives us a secondary result. The abstraction operation and all its scourging procedures are merely procedures to purge and eliminate one part of the real in order to isolate the other. Eliminate one part of the real in order to isolate the other. As such, the abstraction operation and all its scouring procedures leave no trace in the extracted part. Every trace of their operation is eliminated along with the part of the real they were intended to eliminate. However, something of the reality of this elimination work is represented, but not at all as one might expect, in the result of this operation, since the result is nothing but the pure and perfect real essence, but rather in the conditions of the operation. To be precise, in the structure of the real object, from which the knowledge operation has to extract the real essence. To this end, that real object is endowed with a very special structure which we have already encountered in our analysis, but which we must now examine more closely. The structure concerns precisely the respective positions in the real of the two constitutive parts of the real, the inessential part and the essential part. The inessential part occupies the whole of the outside of the object, its visible surface, while the essential part occupies the inside part of the real object, its invisible kernel. The relation between the visible and the invisible is therefore identical to the relation between the outside and the inside, between the dross and the kernel. If the essence is not immediately visible, it is because it is concealed in the strong sense, i.e., entirely covered and enveloped by the dross of the inessential. That is the only trace of the knowledge operation, but it is a trace realized in the respective positions of the inessential and the essential in the real object itself. And at the same time, it establishes the necessity for the operation of real extraction and for the scoring procedures indispensable to the discovery of the essence. Discovery should be taken in discovery's most literal sense, removing the covering, as the husk is removed from the nut, the peel from the fruit, the veil from the girl, the truth, the god or the statue, etc. Footnote: I am neither inventing nor joking. Michelangelo developed a whole aesthetic of artistic production based not on the production of the essential form of the marble material, but on the destruction of the non-form, which envelopes the form to be disengaged even before the first chip is cut out. A practice of aesthetic production is here buried in an empiricist realism of extraction. End footnote. I am not looking in these concrete examples for the origin of this structure. I cite them as a number of mirror images in which all the philosophies of vision have reflected their complacency. Do I still need to show that this problematic of the empiricist conception of knowledge is the twin brother of the problematic of the religious vision of the essence and the transparency of existence? The empiricist conception may be thought as a variant of the conception of vision, with the mere difference that transparency is not given from the beginning, but is separated from itself precisely by the veil, the dross of impurities, the inessential which steal the essence from us, and which abstraction, by abstraction's techniques of separation and scouring, sets aside, in order to give us the real presence of the pure naked essence, knowledge of which is then merely sight. Let us now consider this structure of empiricist knowledge from a critical distance. We can characterize it as a conception which thinks the knowledge of that real object itself as a real part of the real object to be known. This part may be called essential, internal, hidden, and hence invisible at first glance, but is posed nevertheless, precisely because of these properties, as a real component part of the reality of the real object, compounded with the inessential part. What represents capital K knowledge, i.e., that very special operation performed with respect to the real object to be known, and which is not nothing, but, on the contrary, adds to the real existing object a new existence, precisely the existence of its knowledge, e.g., at the very least, the verbal or written conceptual discourse, which pronounces this knowledge in the form of a message. Hence, what represents that knowledge, but is performed outside the object, being the deed of an active subject, is completely inscribed in the structure of the real object. Being the deed of an active subject is completely inscribed in the structure of the real object, in the form of the difference between the inessential and the essence, between surface and depth, between outside and inside, exclamation point. Knowledge is therefore already really present in the real object knowledge has to know, in the form of the respective dispositions of its two real parts, exclamation point. Knowledge is completely and really presented in it, not only its object, which is the real part called the essence, but also its operation, which is the distinction and the respective position that really exist between the two parts of the real object, of which one, the inessential, is the outer part which conceals and envelopes the other, the essence or inner part. This investment of knowledge, conceived as a real part of the real object, in the real structure of the real object, is what constitutes the specific problematic of the empiricist conception of knowledge. I'm going to read that again. This investment of knowledge, conceived as a real part of the real object, in the real structure of the real object, is what constitutes the specific problematic of the empiricist conception of knowledge. Once this has been firmly grasped in its concept, we can draw some important conclusions which will naturally go beyond what this concept says, since it will give us a confession of what this concept does while denegating it. I cannot deal with the last of these conclusions here, but they're easily developed, particularly where they involve the structure of the visible and the invisible, a foretaste of whose importance can be detected here. I only want to note in passing that the categories of empiricism are at the heart of the problematic of classical philosophy. That a recognition of this problematic, even in its variants, including the mute variants and their denegations, can give a projected history of philosophy an essential principle for the construction of its concept during this period. That this problematic avowed by the 18th century from Locke to Condillac, is profoundly present in Hegelian philosophy, however paradoxical this may seem, and that Marx, for the reasons we are analyzing, had to use it to think the lack of a concept whose effects he had produced nevertheless, to formulate the absent question, i.e. that concept which he had answered nevertheless in the analysis of Capital, that this problematic has survived the wear it received from its twisting and distortion by Marx, who transformed it in fact, although he still used it in its terms, appearance and essence, outside and inside, inner essence of things, real and apparent movement, etc., that we find it at work in many passages of Engels and Lenin, who found a motive for its use in the ideological battles in which the most urgent partying was required beneath the enemy's brutal assault, and on his chosen, quote, terrain, end quote, first of all by turning against him his own weapons and blows, i.e. his ideological arguments and concepts. I only want to insist on one particular point, the play on words which this conception is based in, which involves the concept, quote, real, end quote. In fact, it is possible to give a first characterization of this empiricist conception of knowledge as a play on the word, quote, real, end quote. We have just seen that the whole of knowledge, both its peculiar object, the essence of the real object, and the distinction between the real object to which its knowledge operation is applied. In this knowledge operation, a distinction which is the site itself of the operation of knowledge, we have just seen that the object as well as the operation of knowledge in its distinction from the real object, knowledge of which it proposes to produce, are posed in thought as belonging by right to the real structure of the real object. For the empiricist conception of knowledge, the whole of knowledge is thus invested in the real. The knowledge never arises except as a relation inside its real object, between the really distinct parts of that real subject. Of that real object. I'm going to repeat that again. For the empiricist conception of knowledge, the whole knowledge is thus invested in the real, and the knowledge never arises except as a relation inside its real object between the really distinct parts of that real object. Once this basic structure has been firmly grasped, it provides with a key in numerous circumstances, in particular to gauge the theoretical status of the modern forms of empiricism, which present themselves to us in the innocent form of a theory of models, which I hope to have shown is utterly foreign to Marx. Footnote. Note carefully that here I only discuss and reject the theory of models as an ideology of knowledge. In this respect, however elaborate its forms, e.g. contemporary neopositivism, the theory of models as an ideology remains an avatar of the empiricist concept of knowledge. This rejection does not include within its ban another meaning and use of the category, quote, model, end quote, precisely the meaning that effectively corresponds to the technical use of, quote, models, end quote, as can be seen in various circumstances in the technical practice of planning in the socialist countries. The, quote, model, end quote, is then a technical means with which to compound the different data with a view to obtaining a certain goal. The empiricism of the, quote, model, end quote, is then in its place, at home, not in the theory of knowledge, but in practical application, i.e. in the order of the technique, for realizing certain aims at a function of certain data, as a function of certain data, on the basis of certain knowledges provided by the science of political economy. In a famous phrase which has unfortunately not had the echo it deserved in practice, Stalin condemned the confusion of political economy and economic policy, of theory with its technical application. The empiricist conception of the model as an ideology of knowledge obtains all the appearances necessary for its imposture from the confusion between the technical instrument that a model in fact is and the concept of knowledge. End footnote. More distant from us, but closer to Marx in Feuerbach and the works of the Break, the theses on Feuerbach and the German ideology, will help us understand the perpetual play on the words, quote, real, and, quote, concrete, on which is based a whole series of ambiguities whose delayed effects we are suffering from today. Footnote. The brilliant errors of Politzer's Critique des fondements de la psychologie largely depends on the ideological function of the uncriticized concept of the, quote, concrete. It's no accident that Politzer's proclamation of the arrival of, quote, concrete psychology, end quote, was never followed by any works. All the virtue of the term, quote, concrete, end quote, was in fact exhausted in its critical use, without it ever founding the slightest amounts of knowledge, which only exist in the, quote, abstraction, end quote, of concepts. It was already possible to see this even in Feuerbach, who tried desperately to free himself from ideology by invoking the, quote, concrete, end quote, i.e. the ideological concept which confuses knowledge and being. Obviously, ideology cannot liberate ideology. The same ambiguity and the same play on words can be found in all the interpreters of Marx who refer themselves to the early works, invoking, quote, real, quote, concrete, or, quote, positive humanism as a theoretical basis of Marx's work. They do have excuses, it is true. All Marx's own expressions in the works of the Break, the theses on Feuerbach, the German ideology, speak of the concrete, the real, or, quote, real concrete man, etc. But the works of the Break themselves are still trapped in the ambiguity of a negation which still clings to the universe of the concepts it rejects, without having succeeded in adequately formulating the new and positive concepts it brings with it. End footnote. But I shall not take this extraordinarily rich critical path. I shall leave its effects to the play on words which produce them, and their refutation to the growing vigilance of our time. I am interested in the play on words itself. This play on words plays on a difference it kills. At the same time, it spirits away the corpse. Let us look at the name of the victim of this subtle murder. When empiricism designates the essence as the object of knowledge, it omits something important and denegates it in the same instant. It admits that the knowledge of object of knowledge is not identical to the real object, since it declares that this is only a part of the real object. But it denegates what it has admitted, precisely by reducing this difference between two objects, the object of knowledge and the real object, to a mere distinction between the parts of a single object, the real object. In the admitted analysis, there are two distinct objects, the real object, quote, which exist outside the subject independent of the process of knowledge, end quote, Marx, and the object of knowledge, the essence of the real object, which is quite clearly distinct from the real object. Hence we are within our rights in concluding that the true play on words has deceived us to its sight. Its bearer, träger, the word which is its ambiguous seat. The true play on words is not a play on the word, quote, real, end quote, which is its mask, but on the word, quote, object, end quote. Is not the word, quote, real, end quote, which needs to be interrogated in connection with the murder, but the word, quote, object, end quote. The difference of the concept of object must be produced to deliver it from the fraudulent unity of the word, quote, object. One second, excuse me. Where am I here? Get some coffee. Okay, section 11. This sets us off on a path which was opened for us almost without our knowledge. I think for we have not really considered it by two philosophers in history, Spinoza and Marx, against what should really be called the latent dogmatic empiricism of Cartesian idealism. Spinoza warned us that the object of knowledge or essence was in itself absolutely distinct and different from the real object. For, to repeat his famous aphorism, the two objects must not be confused. The idea of the circle, which is the object of knowledge, must not be confused with the circle, which is the real object. In the third section of the 1857 introduction, Marx took up this principle as forcefully as possible. Marx rejected the Hegelian confusion which identifies the real object with the object of knowledge, the real process with the knowledge process. Quote, Hegel fell into the illusion of conceiving the real, das Reale, as the product of thought concentrating itself, probing thought's own depths, and unfolding thought's self out of itself by itself, whereas the method of rising from the abstract to the concrete is only the way, die Art, in which thought appropriates the concrete, reproduciert, it is the concrete in the mind, geistig konkretes. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. This confusion, which in Hegel takes the form of an absolute idealism of history, is in principle simply a variant of the confusion which characterizes the problematic of empiricism. Against this confusion, Marx defends the distinction between the real object, the real concrete of the real totality which, quote, retains its autonomous existence outside the head, just as before, end quote, and the object of knowledge, a product of the thought which produces it in itself as a thought concrete, Gedanken concretum, as a thought totality, Gedanken Totalität, i.e., as a thought object, absolutely distinct from the real object, the concrete, the real totality, knowledge of which is maintained precisely by the thought concrete, the thought totality, etc. Marx goes even further and shows that this distinction involves not only these two objects, but also their peculiar production processes. While the production process of a given real object, a given real concrete totality, e.g., a given historical nation, takes place entirely in the real and is carried out according to the real order of real genesis, the order of succession of the moments of historical genesis. The production process of the object of knowledge takes place entirely in knowledge and is carried out according to a different order, in which the thought categories which, quote, reproduce, end quote, the real categories, do not occupy the same place as they do in the order of real historical genesis, but quite different places assigned them by their function in the production process of the object of knowledge. Let us look closely at all these themes for a moment. When Marx tells us that the production process of knowledge, and hence that of its object, as distinct from the real object which is its precise aim to appropriate in the, quote, mode, end quote, of knowledge, takes place entirely in knowledge, in the, quote, head, end quote, or in thought, he is not for 1 second falling into an idealism of consciousness, mind, or thought. For the, quote, thought, end quote, we are discussing here is not a faculty of a transcendental subject or absolute consciousness confronted by the real world as matter, nor is this thought a faculty of a psychological subject. Although human individuals are its agents, this thought is the historically constituted system of an apparatus of thought founded on and articulated to natural and social reality. It is defined by the system of real conditions which make it, if I dare use the phrase, a determinate mode of production of knowledge. As such, it is constituted by a structure which combines, quote, Verbindung, and, quote, the type of object, raw material in which it labors, the theoretical means of production available, its theory, its method, and its technique, experimental or otherwise, and the historical relations, both theoretical, ideological, and social, in which it produces. This definite system of conditions of theoretical practice is what assigns any given thinking subject, individual, its place and function in the production of knowledges. This system of theoretical production, a material as well as, quote, a, quote, mental, end quote, system, whose practice is founded on and articulated to the existing economic, political, and ideological practices, which directly or indirectly provide it with the essentials of its, quote, raw materials, end quote, has a determinate objective reality. This determinate reality is what defines the roles and functions of the, quote, thought, end quote, of particular individuals, who can only, quote, think, end quote, the, quote, problems, end quote, already actually or potentially posed. Hence it is also what sets to work their, quote, thought power, end quote, in the way that the structure of an economic mode of production sets to work the labor power of its immediate producers, but according to its own peculiar mode. Far from being in essence opposed to the material world, the faculty of a, quote, pure, end quote, transcendental subject or, quote, absolute consciousness, end quote, i.e. the myths that idealism produces as myth, in which to recognize and establish itself, quote, thought, end quote, is a peculiar real system established on and articulated to the real world of a given historical society, which maintains determinate relations with nature, a specific system, defined by the conditions of its existence and practice, i.e. by peculiar structure, a determinate type of, quote, combination, end quote, Verbindung. between its peculiar raw material, the object of theoretical practice, its peculiar means of production, and its relations with the other structures of society. Once it is accepted that this is how, quote, thought, end quote, the very general term Marx used in the passage we are analyzing, must be defined, it is perfectly legitimate to say that the production of knowledge which is peculiar to theoretical practice constitutes a process that takes place entirely in thought. Just as we can say, mutatis mutandis, that the process of economic production takes place entirely in the economy, and even though it implies and precisely in the specific determinations of its structure necessary relations with nature and the other structures, legal, political, and ideological, which, taken together, constitute the global structure of a social formation belonging to a determinate mode of production, is therefore perfectly legitimate, richtig, to say, as Marx does, that, quote, the concrete totality is a totality of thoughts, concrete in thought, in fact, in der Tat, a product of thinking and comprehending, ein Produkt des Denkens, des Begreifens. It is perfectly legitimate to imagine theoretical practice, i.e., thought's labor on its raw material, the work on the object it works on, as the, quote, working up, Verarbeitung, of observation and conception, Anschauung und Vorstellung, into concepts, in Begriffe, end quote, Grundrisse. Elsewhere, in the book For Marx, I have tried to show that the raw material which the mode of production of knowledge works on, i.e., what Marx calls here Anschauung and Vorstellung, the material of intuition and representation, had to take very different forms according to the degree of development of knowledge in its history. For example, that there is a great difference between the raw material on which Aristotle worked and the raw material on which Galileo, Newton, or Einstein worked, but that formally this raw material is part of the conditions of production of all knowledge. But that formally this raw material is a part of the conditions of production of all knowledge. I also tried to show that even though it is clear to everyone that the greater the progress of a branch of knowledge, the more elaborate becomes the raw material, though the raw material of a developed science obviously has nothing in common with, quote, pure, end quote, sensuous intuition or mere, quote, representation, end quote. Nevertheless, how far back we ascend into the past of a branch of knowledge, we are never dealing with a, quote, pure, end quote, sensuous intuition or representation, but with an always already complex raw material, a structure of, quote, intuition or, quote, representation, which combines together in a peculiar, quote, Verbindung, end quote, sensuous, technical, and ideological elements, that therefore knowledge never, as empiricism desperately demands it should, confronts a pure object, which is then identical to the real object, of which knowledge aimed to produce precisely, the knowledge. Knowledge working on its, quote, object, end quote, then does not work on the real object, but on the peculiar raw material, which constitutes, in the strict sense of the term, its, quote, object, end quote, parenthesis, of knowledge, end parenthesis, and which, even in the most rudimentary forms of knowledge, is distinct from the real object. For that raw material is always already, in the strong sense Marx gives this in capital, a raw material, i.e. matter already elaborated and transformed, precisely by the imposition of the complex, sensuous technical and ideological structure, which constitutes it as an object of knowledge, however crude, which constitutes it as the object it will transform, whose forms it will change in the course of its development process in order to produce knowledges which are constantly transformed, but always applied to its object in the sense of object of knowledge. Section 12. It would be rash to go any further for the moment. The formal concept of the production conditions of theoretical practice alone cannot provide the specific concepts which will enable us to constitute a history of theoretical practice, let alone the history of the different branches of theoretical practice, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, history, and the other, quote, human sciences, end quote. To go beyond the merely formal concept of the structure of theoretical practice, i.e. of the production of knowledges, we must work out the concept of the history of knowledge, the concepts of the different modes of theoretical production, most important, the concepts of the theoretical mode of production of ideology and science, and the peculiar concepts of the different branches of theoretical production and of their relations, the different sciences and their specific types of dependence, independence, and articulation. This work of theoretical elaboration presupposes a very long-term investigation, which will have to build on the valuable work that has already been done in the classical domains of the history of sciences, the sciences, and of epistemology, i.e. an investigation which appropriates all the raw material provided by the, quote, facts, end quote, that have already been collected or await collection, and by the first theoretical results established in these domains. But the mere collection of these, quote, facts, end quote, these empirical, quote, givens, end quote, which, with a very few remarkable exceptions, are generally only presented in the form of simple sequences or chronicles, i.e. in the form of an ideological conception of history, or even in the a priori of a philosophy of history, the mere collection of these facts is not enough to constitute a theory of knowledge, the concept of which must be constructed, at least in a provisional form, before it can be undertaken. Footnote. In France, the work of Gaston Bachelard, Cavaliers, Canguilhem, and Foucault. End footnote. In the papers you are about to read, we have paid great attention to the concepts in which Marx thinks the general conditions of economic production, and the concepts in which Marxist thought must think its theory of history, not only in order to grasp the Marxist theory of the economic region of the capitalist mode of production, but also to ascertain as far as possible the basic concepts, production and structure of a mode of production, history, whose formal elaboration is equally indispensable to the Marxist theory of the production of knowledge and its history, and to its history. We are now beginning to get some idea of the path these investigations are taking and will take. This path leads us to a revolution in the traditional concept of the history of the sciences, which today is still profoundly steeped in the ideology of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. i.e. in a teleological and therefore idealist rationalism. We are beginning to suspect and even to be able to prove in a number of already studied examples that the history of reason is neither a linear history of continuous development, nor in its continuity a history of the progressive manifestation or emergence into consciousness of a capital R reason, which is completely present in germ in its origins, and which its history merely reveals to the light of day. We know that this type of history and rationality is merely the effect of the retrospective illusion of a grand historical result, which writes its history in the, quote, future anterior, end quote, and which therefore thinks its origins as the anticipation of its end. The rationality of the philosophy of the Enlightenment to which Hegel gave the systematic form of the development of the concepts is merely an ideological conception both of reason and of reason's history. The real history of the development of knowledge appears to us today to be subject to laws quite different from this teleological hope or the religious triumph of reason. We are beginning to conceive this history as a history punctuated by radical discontinuities, e.g., when a new science detaches itself from the background of earlier ideological formations, profound reorganizations which, if they respect the continuity of the existence of regions of knowledge, even this is not always the case, nevertheless inaugurate with their rupture the reign of a new logic, which far from being a mere development, the, quote, truth, end quote, or, quote, inversion, end quote, of the old one, literally takes its place. We are thereby obliged to renounce every teleology of reason and to conceive the historical relation between a result and its conditions of existence as a relation of production and not of expression, and therefore as what, in a phrase that clashes with the classical system of categories and demands the replacement of those categories themselves, we can call the necessity of its contingency. The necessity of its contingency. To grasp this necessity, we must grasp the very special and paradoxical logic that leads to this production, i.e. the logic of the conditions of the production of knowledges, whether they belong to the history of a branch of still ideological knowledge or to a branch of knowledge attempting to constitute itself as a science or already established as a science. We can expect many surprises from this series, like those we have had from Cangelham's work on the history of the production of the reflex concept, which, despite what all the appearances, i.e. the dominant ideological conceptions would lead us to think, was the fruit not of a mechanistic but of a vitalist philosophy. Like those we owe to Michel Foucault's studies of the disconcerting development of the complex cultural formation which in the 17th and 18th centuries groped around the overdetermined word, quote, madness, end quote. A whole series of medical, legal, religious, ethical, and political practices and ideologies, and a combination whose internal dispositions and meaning varied as a function of the changing place and role of these terms in the more general context of the economic, political, legal, and ideological structures of the time. Like that which we owe to Michel Foucault, who has revealed to us the set of apparently heterogeneous conditions, which in fact is the outcome of a laborious, quote, labor of the positive, end quote, conspired in the production of what seems to us obviousness itself, the observation of the patient by the, quote, gaze, end quote, of clinical medicine. See Foucault's Madness and Civilization and Birth of the Clinic and Archaeology of Medical Perception. Even the theoretically essential and practically decisive distinction between science and ideology thereby gets some protection against the dogmatist or scientistic temptations which it threaten it. Since in this work of investigation and conceptualization we have to learn not to make use of this distinction in a way that restores the ideology of the philosophy of the Enlightenment, but on the contrary to treat the ideology which constitutes the prehistory of a science, for example, as a real history with its own laws and as the real prehistory whose real confrontation with other technical practices and other ideological or scientific acquisitions. Was capable, in a specific theoretical conjuncture, of producing the arrival of a science not as its goal but as its surprise. The fact that this will force us to pose the problem of the conditions of the, quote, epistemological rupture, end quote, which inaugurates each sentence, i.e. meaning to classical terminology, the problem of the conditions of scientific discovery, and the fact that we shall have to pose this problem for Marx as well, considerably increases our task. The fact that just as we are studying this problem, we have to think, in a completely novel way, the relation between a science and the ideology which gave rise to that science, and which continues to accompany that science silently, more or less throughout its history. The fact that such an investigation confronts us with the observation that every science, in the relationship it has with the ideology it emerged from, can only be thought as a, quote, science of the ideology, end quote, would disconcert us, were we not forewarned of the nature of the object of knowledge, which can only exist in the form of ideology at the moment of constitution of the science, which is going to produce knowledge from it in the specific mode that defines it. If all these examples do give us a first idea of the new conception of the history of knowledge we have to produce, they also suggest the scale of the work of historical investigation and theoretical elaboration which is in store. Section 13. Now I come to a second of Marx's decisive comments. The text of the 1857 introduction, which distinguishes between the real object and the object of knowledge, also distinguishes between their processes, and what is crucial, brings out a difference in order in the genesis of these two processes. To use a different vocabulary, one that constantly recurs in Capital, Marx declares that the order which governs the categories of thought in the process of knowledge does not coincide with the order which governs the real categories in the process of real historical genesis. This distinction obviously has great bearing on one of the most disputed questions in Capital, the question as to whether there is an identity between the so-called, quote, logical, end quote, order, or order of, quote, deduction, end quote, of the categories in Capital, and the real, quote, historical order, and real, quote, historical, end quote, order. I don't know if he's referring to this, but if he's referring to whether the part of chapter 1 concerned with developing the necessity of money for realizing general commodity exchange, which has historically, starting with Engels, been interpreted as a historical logical explanation of a historical process trimmed of all its contingencies. If that's what and like the critique of that is what he's referring to, I recommend to you on the channel that I have a video from Chris Arthur titled "The Myth of Simple Commodity Production," which is precisely on this topic, arguing that what is being achieved in Chapter 1 of Capital is not a historical gloss of the movement from simple commodity to barter, from barter to money. And he also argues against the... there's a whole army of bunnies. 3 bunnies chasing each other right in front of me. Also argues that against the solution to the historical solution to the transformation problem, which the transformation problem is like what is the relationship, the seemingly contradictory relationship between value, as Marx articulates it in Volume 1, and his later articulation of prices of production in Volume 3. The answer to that question is that, that Engels kind of provides is that, once upon a time, commodities did trade at their value, which is what is covered in Volume 1, and then eventually, with the development of capitalism, prices of production came to dominate with the differentiation of the value composition of different industries, something like that. So this kind of idea that capital is almost kind of like a grand, logically abstract gloss on the history of capitalism. And that's how a lot of people have interpreted the book Capital. But for a critique of that, check out the work I have by people like Chris Arthur, Riccardo Bellafiore. I think basically most of the critiques of political economy related pieces that I have on the channel would object to that interpretation of Capital very strongly. So it appears that that's what Riccardo Bellafiore, Louis Althusser is referring to here. That kind of question of what is capital? Is capital, an empirical investigation of England in a particular place? Is it a historical gloss on the history of capitalism? Or is it defining the necessary features of a capitalist mode of production in its ideal average, which I think is generally what a lot of people, especially people who would consider themselves part of the value form analysis interpretation of capital, would say that what the book Capital fundamentally is. But anyway, all I'm really trying to say with all that gibberish is check out the videos by Chris Arthur, The Myth of Simple Commodity Production, on this channel. Anyway, let me get back to the reading. This distinction obviously has great bearing on one of the most disputed questions in Capital, the question as to whether there is an identity between the so-called, quote, logical, end quote, order, or order of, quote, deduction, end quote, of the categories in Capital, and the real, quote, historical, end quote, order. Most interpreters cannot really, quote, get out, end quote, of this question successfully, because most interpreters refuse to pose it in adequate terms, i.e. in the field of the problematic this question requires. To say the same thing in a different, but now familiar way, Capital gives us a whole series of answers as to the identity or non-identity of the, quote, logical and, quote, historical, end quote, orders. These answers are answers without any explicit question. They therefore pose for us the question of their questions, i.e. they impose on us the task of formulating the unformulated question which these questions answer. It is clear that this question concerns the relation between the logical and historical orders, but in pronouncing these words, we are merely adopting the terms of the answers. What governs the posing, and hence production, of a question in the last resort is a definition of the field of the problematic in which this problem, must be posed. But most interpreters pose this question in the field of an empiricist problematic, or its, quote, inversion, end quote, in the strict sense, in the field of a Hegelian problematic, seeking to prove, in the first case, the, quote, logical, end quote, order, being identical in essence with the real order and existing in the reality of the real order as its essence itself, can only follow the real order. In the second case, that the real order being identical in essence with the, quote, logical, end quote, order, the real order, which is then merely the existence of the logical order, must follow the logical order. In both cases, the interpreters are obliged to do violence to certain of Marx's answers which manifestly contradict their hypotheses. I propose to pose this question, this problem, not in the field of an ideological problematic, but in the field of the Marxist theoretical problematic, with its distinction between the real object and the object of knowledge, registering the fact that this distinction of objects implies a radical distinction between between the order in which, quote, categories, end quote, appear in knowledge on the one hand, and in historical reality on the other. Once the so-called problem of the relation between the order of real historical genesis and the order of development of the concepts in scientific discourse, in the field of this problematic, the radical distinction between these two orders has been posed, we can conclude that the problem we are discussing is an imaginary problem. Given this hypothesis, we can respect the variety of the answers Marx gives, i.e. both the cases of correspondence and those of non-correspondence between the, quote, logical order and the, quote, real, end quote, order, so long as we can admit no one-to-one correspondence between the different moments of these two distinct orders. When I say that the distinction between the real object and the object of knowledge implies the disappearance of the ideological, empiricist or absolute idealist myth of a one-to-one correspondence between the terms of these two orders, I include every form, even an inverted form of one-to-one correspondence with the terms of the two orders. For an inverted correspondence is still a term-by-term correspondence according to a common order, with only a change in the sign. I evoke this last hypothesis because it has been held by Della Volpe and his school to be essential to understanding not only the theory of capital, but also the Marxist, quote, theory of knowledge, end quote. This interpretation depends on a few sentences from Marx, the clearest of which appears in the 1857 introduction, in the Grundrisse. Quote, it would therefore be unfeasible and wrong to let the economic categories follow one another in the same sequence as that in which they were historically decisive. The sequence is determined rather by their relation to one another in modern bourgeois society, which is precisely the opposite Erta of that which seemed to be their natural order, or which corresponds to historical development, end quote. By appealing to this Umkehrung, this, quote, inversion, end quote, of sense, the logical order can be claimed to be a term-by-term inversion of the historical order. On this point, I refer the reader to Rancière's paper in this volume. But what immediately follows this passage in Marx's text leaves us in no doubt. For we learn that this dispute over the direct or inverted correspondence between the terms of the two orders has nothing to do with the problem under analysis. Quote, the point is not the historic position of the economic relations and the succession of different forms of society, ... Rather, articulated combination, Gliederung, within modern bourgeois society, end quote. Page 108, translation modified. It is precisely the Gliederung, this articulated thought totality, which has to be produced in knowledge as an object of knowledge, in order to reach a knowledge of the real Gliederung, of the real articulated totality, which constitutes the existence of bourgeois society. The order in which the thought Gliederung is produced is a specific order, precisely the order of the theoretical analysis Marx performed in Capital, the order of the liaison and, quote, synthesis, end quote, of the concepts necessary for the production of a thought whole, a thought concrete, the theory of capital, the book Capital. The order in which these concepts are articulated in the analysis is the order of Marx's scientific proof. It has no direct one-to-one relationship with the order in which any particular category may have appeared in history. There may be temporary encounters, fragmentary sequences apparently rhythmed by the same order, but far from proving the existence of this correspondence or answering the question of the correspondence, they pose a different question. Without the theory of the distinction between the two orders, it is impossible to examine whether it is legitimate to pose this question, which is by no means certain. This question might be meaningless. We have grounds to think that it is meaningless. Hey, bunny. Quite to the contrary, Marx spends his time showing, not without malice, that the real order contradicts the logical order, and if verbally he occasionally goes so far as to say that there is a, quote, inverted, end quote, relationship between the two orders, we cannot take this word literally as a concept, i.e. as a rigorous affirmation which takes its meaning not from the fact that it has been put forward, but from the fact that it belongs by right to a definite theoretical field. Rancière's demonstration shows, on the contrary, that the term, quote, inversion, end quote, here as often elsewhere, is, in capital, a point of analogy, without any theoretical rigor, i.e. without the rigor which is imposed on us by the theoretical problematic which underlies the whole of Marx's analysis, and which must be identified and defined before we can judge the legitimacy or weakness of a term, or even of a sentence. It would be easy to extend this demonstration successfully to all the passages which encourage the interpretation of an inverted one-to-one correspondence between the terms of the two orders. Section 14. I shall therefore return to the character peculiar to the order of the concepts in the exposition of Marx's analysis, i.e. in Marx's proof. It is one thing to say that this order of concepts, or, quote, logical, end quote, order, is a specific order, without any one-to-one relationship to its terms with those of the historical order. It is another to explain the specificity, i.e. the nature of this order, as an order. To pose this question is obviously to pose the question of the form of order, required at a given moment in the history of knowledge by the existing type of scientificity, or, if you prefer, by the norms of theoretical validity recognized by science in its own practice as scientific. This is still a problem of great scope and complexity, and a problem which presupposes the elucidation of a number of preliminary theoretical problems. The essential problem presupposed by the question of the existing type of demonstrativity is the problem of the history of the production of the different forms in which theoretical practice, producing knowledges, whether, quote, ideological or, quote, scientific, end quote, recognizes the validating norms it demands. I propose to call this history the history of the theoretical as such, or the history of the production and transformation of what at a given moment in the history of knowledge constitutes the theoretical problematic, to which are related all the existing validating criteria, and hence the forms required to give the order of theoretical discourse the force and value of a proof. This history of the theoretical, of the structures of theoreticity, and of the forms of theoretical apodicity, has yet to be constituted, and there too, as Marx said when he began his work, there, quote, exists an enormous literature, end quote, at our disposal. But these elements at our disposal, often of considerable value, particularly in the history of philosophy treated as the history of the, quote, theory of knowledge, end quote, are one thing, and their theoretical organization, which presupposes precisely the formation, the production of this theory, is another. I have only made this detour in order to be able to say, when returning to Marx, that the apodictic character of the order of his theoretical discourse, or the, quote, logical, end quote, order of the categories in capital, can only be thought against the background of a theory of the history of the theoretical, which would show that what effective relationship there is between the forms of proof in the theoretical course of capital, on the one hand, and the forms of theoretical proof contemporaneous with it and close to it, on the other. In this perspective, the comparative study of Marx and Hegel is indispensable once again. But it does not exhaust our object. In this perspective, the comparative study of Marx and Hegel is indispensable once again. Sorry, I got distracted. But it does not exhaust our object, for we are often warned by Marx's constant references to forms of proof other than the forms of philosophical discourse, that he also uses the forms of proof borrowed from mathematics, physics, chemistry, astronomy, etc. Footnote: a discourse inaugurated by Descartes, expressly conscious of the crucial importance of the, quote, order of reasons, end quote, in philosophy, as well as in the sciences, and also conscious of the distinction between the order of knowledge and the order of being, despite his lapse into a dogmatic empiricism. End footnote. We are therefore constantly warned by Marx himself of the complex and original character of the order of proof he installs in political economy. Marx says himself in a letter to Lechat, quote, the method of analysis which I have employed and which had not previously been applied to economic subjects makes the reading of the first chapters rather arduous, end quote. The method of analysis Marx mentions is the same as, quote, the method of presentation, end quote, Darstellungsweise. Marx refers to in the afterword to the second German edition and carefully distinguishes from the, quote, method of inquiry, end quote, Forschungsweise. The, quote, method of inquiry, end quote, is Marx's several years long concrete investigation into existing documents and the facts they witness to. This investigation followed paths which disappear in their result, the knowledge of its object, the capitalist mode of production. The protocols of Marx's, quote, inquiry, end quote, are contained in part in his notebooks. But in Capital we find something quite different from the complex and varied procedures, the, quote, trials and errors, end quote, that every investigation contains and which express the peculiar logic of the process of the inventor's discovery at the level of his theoretical practice. In Capital we find a systematic presentation, an apodictic arrangement of the concepts in the form of that type of demonstrational discourse that Marx calls analysis. What is the provenance of this, quote, analysis, end quote, which Marx must have regarded as pre-existent since he only demanded its application to political economy? We pose this question as one indispensable to an understanding of Marx, and one which we are not yet in a position to give an exhaustive answer. Our papers do bear on this analysis, on the forms of reasoning and proof which it sets to work, and in the first place on those almost inaudible words, those apparently neutral words which Macherey, or Macherey, I'm not sure how to say it, studies in the first sentences of Capital, and to which we have all tried to lend our ears. Literally, in the actual discourse of Capital, these words carry the occasional semi-silent discourse of its proof. If, even despite the letter of Marx's work, we have succeeded in reconstituting the sequence and the peculiar logic of the silent discourse in certain delicate points, if we have managed to identify and fill these blanks, if we have been lucky enough to replace some of these still hesitant words by other, more rigorous terms, then that is all we have done. If we have been able to establish with enough proof to state it, that Marx's discourse is in principle foreign to Hegel's, that his dialectic, the afterword identifies it with the mode of exposition we are discussing, is quite different from the Hegelian dialectic, then it is all we have done. We have not gone on to see whence Marx took this method of analysis, which he presented it as if it were pre-existent, this method of analysis were pre-existent. We have not posed the analysis as to whether Marx, far from borrowing it, did not himself invent this method of analysis which he thought he was merely applying. As he really did invent the dialectic which tells us he took from Hegel in certain well-known passages which are too often rehashed by hurried interpreters. And if this analysis and this dialectic are simply, as we believe, one and the same thing, it is not a sufficient explanation of their original production. Excuse me. This is the first part's in italics. I was going to read the whole thing twice, so the sentence is too long. But the first clause in the sentence, I guess. The first couple are italicized. And if this analysis and this dialect are simply, as we believe, one and the same thing, is not a sufficient explanation of their original production to stress that it was only possible at the cost of a rupture with Hegel, we must also exhibit the positive conditions for this production, the possible positive models which, reflecting themselves in the personal theoretical conjuncture to which Marx's history had led him, produced this dialectic in his thought. We are not in a situation to do this. Of course, the differences we have brought to light will be able to serve as indices and as theoretical guides to such an investigation. But they cannot take its place. And there's a more than even chance that, if as we believe this first attempt at a philosophical reading suggests, Marx really did invent a new form of order for axiomatic analysis, what is true of the majority of the great inventors in the history of the theoretical must be true of him as well. Time is needed for his discovery, before his discovery will be even be accepted, and only then will it pass into normal scientific practice. A thinker who installs a new order in the theoretical, a new form of apodicticity, or scientificity, has quite a different fate from a thinker who establishes a new science. He may long remain unknown and misunderstood, particularly if, as is the case with Marx, the revolutionary inventor in the theoretical happens to be masked in the same man by the twin who is a revolutionary inventor in a branch of science, here the science of history. The more partial his reflection of the concept of the revolution he has inaugurated in the theoretical, the greater risk that he will suffer. The risk is redoubled if the cause of the limitations to his conceptual expression of a revolution which affects the theoretical through the discovery of a new science does not lie in personal circumstances or in a, quote, lack of time, end quote, alone. It may lie above all in the degree to which the objective theoretical conditions which govern the possibility of the formulation of these concepts are realized. Indispensable theoretical concepts do not magically construct themselves on command when they are needed. The whole history of the beginnings of sciences or of great philosophies show, on the contrary, that the exact set of new concepts do not march out on a parade in single file. On the contrary, some are long delayed, or march in borrowed clothes before acquiring their proper uniforms. For as long as history fails to provide the tailor and the cloth, in the meantime the concept is certainly present in its works, but in a different form from that of a concept, in a form which is looking for itself inside a form, quote, borrowed, end quote, from other custodians of formulated and indisposable or fascinating concepts. This goes to show that there is nothing incomprehensible in the paradoxical fact that Marx treated his original method of analysis as a method that already existed even in the instant when he invented it, and in the fact that he thought he was borrowing from Hegel even in the instant when he broke his Hegelian moorings. This paradox alone requires an amount of work which we have hardly more than outlined here, and which undoubtedly contains many surprises for us. 1 second. Section 15. But we have gone far enough in this work for a return to the difference between the order of the object of knowledge and that of the real object to enable us to approach the problem whose index this difference is, the problem of the relation between these two objects, the object of knowledge and the real object, a relation which constitutes the very existence of knowledge. I must warn the reader that we are here entering a domain which is very difficult to approach for two reasons. First, because we have very few Marxist reference points with which to take out its space and orientate ourselves within. In fact, we are confronted by a problem which we not only have to solve but also to pose, for it has not yet really been posed, i.e. uttered on the basis of the required problematic and in the rigorous concepts required by this problematic. Second, and paradoxically, this is the most serious difficulty because we are literally swamped by the abundance of solutions offered to this as yet not rigorously posed problem, swamped by these solutions and blinded by their, quote, obviousness, end quote. These solutions are not, like those we have discussed with respect to Marx, answers to absent questions which can, however, be formulated in order to express the theoretical revolution contained in their answers. On the contrary, they are answers to questions and solutions to problems which have been formulated perfectly, since these questions and problems have been hand-picked by these answers and solutions. I am alluding precisely to what the history of ideology philosophy classifies as the, quote, problem of knowledge, end quote, or, quote, theory of knowledge, end quote. I say ideological philosophy, since it is this ideological posing of the, quote, problem of knowledge which defines the tradition that coincides with Western... Where am I at? Sorry, I lost my space. Which coincides with... I say ideological philosophy, since it is this ideological posing of the, quote, problem of knowledge, end quote, which defines the tradition that coincides with Western idealist philosophy, from Descartes to Husserl via Kant and Hegel. I say that this posing of the, quote, problem, end quote, of knowledge is ideological insofar as the problem has been formulated on the basis of its, quote, answer, end quote, as the exact reflection of that answer, i.e. not as a real problem, but as the problem that had to be posed if the desired ideological solution was to be the solution to this problem. I cannot deal here with this point, which defines the essentials of ideology in its ideological form, and which in principle reduces ideological knowledge, and par excellence, the knowledge which ideology is discussing, when it reflects knowledge in the form of the problem of knowledge or the theory of knowledge, to a phenomenon of recognition, in the theoretical mode of production of ideology, which is utterly different from the theoretical mode of production of science in this respect. The formulation of a problem is merely the theoretical expression of the conditions which allow a solution already produced outside the process of knowledge, because imposed by extra theoretical instances and exigencies, by religious, ethical, political, or other, quote, interest, end quote, to recognize itself in an artificial problem manufactured to serve it both as a theoretical mirror and as a practical justification. All of modern Western philosophy, dominated by the, quote, problem of knowledge, end quote, is thus in fact dominated by the formulation of a, quote, problem, end quote, posed in terms and on a theoretical basis, produced, whether consciously, as by some, or unconsciously, as with others, is not important here, in order to make possible the theoretical practical effects expected of this mirror recognition. In other words, the whole history of Western philosophy is dominated not by the, quote, problem of knowledge, end quote, but by the ideological solution, i.e. the solution imposed and advanced by practical, religious, ethical, and political, quote, interest, end quote, far into the reality of the knowledge, which this, quote, problem, end quote, had to receive. As Marx put it so profoundly in the German ideology, not only in their answers, but in their very questions, there was a mystification. Not only in their answers, but in their very questions, there was a mystification, end quote, Marx, the German ideology. Here we meet our greatest difficulty. For practically alone in this undertaking, we have to resist the age-old, quote, obviousness, end quote, which repetition, not only the repetition of a false answer, but above all that of a false question, has produced in people's minds. We must leave the ideological space defined by this ideological question, this necessarily closed space, since that is one of the essential effects of the recognition structure, which characterizes the theoretical model of production of ideology, the inevitably closed circle of what, in another context and with other intentions, Lacan has called the, quote, dual mirror relation, end quote, in order to open a new space on a different site, the space required for a correct posing of the problem, one which does not prejudge the solution. The whole history of the, quote, theory of knowledge, end quote, in Western philosophy, from the famous, quote, Cartesian circle, end quote, to the circle of the Hegelian or Husserlian teleology of capital R reason, shows us that this, quote, problem of knowledge, end quote, is a closed space, i.e. a vicious circle, the vicious circle of the mirror relation of the ideological recognition. Its high point of consciousness and honesty was reached precisely with the philosophy, Husserl, which was prepared to take theoretical responsibility for the necessary existence of this circle, i.e., to think it as essential where am I? To think it as essential to its ideological undertaking. However, this did not make it leave the circle. This does not make it leave the circle. Did not deliver it from its ideological captivity, nor could the philosopher who has tried to think in a, quote, openness, end quote, which seems to be only the ideological non-closure of the closure, the absolute condition of possibility of this, quote, closure, end quote, i.e. of the closed history of the, quote, repetition, end quote, of this closure in Western metaphysics, Heidegger. It is impossible to leave a closed space simply by taking up a position merely outside that closed space, either in its exterior or its profundity, so long as this outside or profundity remains its outside or profundity. They still belong to that circle, to that closed space, as its, quote, repetition, end quote, in its other than itself. Not the repetition, but the non-repetition of this space is the way out of this circle, the sole theoretically sound flight, which is precisely not a flight, which is always committed to what it is fleeing from, but the radical foundation of a new space, a new problematic which allows the real problem to be posed, the problem misrecognized in the recognition structure in which it is ideologically posed. Section 16. The following few reflections are devoted to a first attempt at posing this problem, though I do not intend to hide the fact that they are as precarious as they are indispensable. In the 1857 introduction, Marx writes, quote, "The totality, as the totality appears, erscheint, thinking ahead which appropriates, eneignet, the world, die Welt, in the only way, einzige Weise. It can, a way different from the artistic, künstlerlich, religious, practical, and mental, praktisch geistig, appropriation of the world," end quote, Grundrisse. Here the issue is not to penetrate the mystery of the concept of appropriation, Aneignung, beneath which Marx expresses the essence of a fundamental relation of which knowledge, art, religion, and, quote, practical mental activity, that this still has to be defined, but it probably means ethico-politico-historical activity, appear as so many distinct and specific modes, Weise. The text does indeed lay stress on the specificity of the mode of theoretical appropriation, knowledge, with respect to all the other modes of appropriation which are declared to be distinct from it in principle. But the expression of this distinction reveals precisely the common ground of a relation to the real world against which this distinction is made. This clearly indicates that knowledge is concerned with the real world through its specific mode of appropriation of the real world, which poses precisely the problem of the way this function works, and therefore of the mechanism that ensures it. This function of the appropriation of the real world by knowledge, i.e. by the process of production of knowledge is, which, despite, or rather because, of the fact that it takes place entirely in thought, in the sense we have defined, nevertheless provides the grasp, the concept, begriff, on the real world, called its appropriation, Eineignung. This poses on its true terrain the question of a theory of the production of a knowledge which, as the knowledge of its object, an object of knowledge, in the sense defined, is the grasp or appropriation of the real object, the real world. Need I comment that this question is quite unlike the ideological question of the, quote, problem of knowledge, end quote. That it is not a matter of an external reflection on the a priori conditions of possibility which guarantee the possibility of knowledge. That it is not a matter of staging the characters indispensable to this scenario, a philosophical consciousness, which is very careful not to pose the question of its status, its place and its function, since in its own eyes it is reason itself, present in its objects since the capital O origin, and to have no dealings except with itself even in its question, i.e. posing the question to which it is itself the obligatory answer, posing scientific consciousness the question of the conditions of possibility of its knowledge relation to its object. Need I comment that the theoretical characters cast in this ideological scenario are the philosophical subject, the philosophizing consciousness, the scientific subject, the knowing consciousness, and the empirical subject, the perceiving consciousness on the one hand, and on the other, the object, capital O, which confronts these three subjects, the transcendental or absolute object, the pure principles of science and the pure forms of perception, that the three subjects for their part are subsumed under a single essence, while the three objects for their part are subsumed under a single essence, e.g. this identification of the three objects, as it is seen, with significant variation, in Kant as well as Hegel and Husserl, depends on a persistent identification of the object perceived and the object known that this parallel distribution of attributes disposes subject and object face to face, that this conjures away the difference in status between the objects of knowledge and the real object on the one side, and the real object on the object side, and the difference in status between the philosophizing subject and the knowing subject on the one hand, and between the knowing subject and the empirical subject on the other, on the subject side, ? That thereby the only relation which is thought is a relation of interiority and contemporaneity between a mythical subject and object required to take in charge, if needed be, by falsifying them, the real conditions, the real mechanism of the history of production knowledges, in order to subject them to religious, ethical, and political ends, the preservation of the faith, of, quote, morality, or of, quote, freedom, i.e. social values, ? I am not posing the question I have posed in order to produce an answer fixed in advance by instances other than knowledge itself. It is not a question closed in advance by its answer. It is not a question of guarantees. On the contrary, it is an open question. It is the very field that it opens, and one which, if it is to be so, if it is to escape the pre-established closure of the ideological circle, must reject the services of those theoretical characters whose sole function was to ensure this ideological closure, the characters of the different subjects and objects, and the duties it was their mission to respect in order to play their parts. In the complicity of the ideological pact signed by the supreme instances of the subject and the object, with the blessing of the Western, quote, freedom of man, end quote. It is a question which is posed and demonstrated as open in principle, i.e. is homogeneous in its structure of openness to all the actual questions posed by knowledge in its scientific existence. A question which has to express in its form this structure of openness, which must therefore be posed in the field and in the terms of the theoretical problematic, which demands this structure of openness. In other words, the question of the mode of appropriation of the real, specific object of knowledge has to be posed. Not quote, it's a list. 1. In terms which exclude any recourse to the ideological solution contained in the ideological characters, subject and object, or to the mutual mirror recognition structure in the closed circle of which they move. 2. In terms which form the concept of the knowledge structure, an open specific structure, in which at the same time are the concept of the question knowledge poses itself, which implies that the place and function of this question be thought even in posing the question. This last demand is indispensable in order to establish the distinction between the theory of history of the production of knowledge, or philosophy, and the existing content of knowledge, the sciences, without thereby making philosophy that legal instance, which in, quote, theories of knowledge, end quote, makes laws for the sciences in the name of a right it arrogates to itself. This right is no more than the fait accompli of mirror recognition's stage direction, which ensures philosophical ideology the legal recognition of the fait accompli of the, quote, higher, end quote, instances it serves. Posed in these strict conditions, the problem we are concerned with can be expressed in the following form. By what mechanism does the process of knowledge, which takes place entirely in thought, produce the cognitive appropriation of its real object, which exists outside thought in the real world? Or, again, by what mechanism does the production of the object of knowledge produce the cognitive appropriation of the real object, which exists outside thought in the real world? I'm going to repeat that sentence because that's all in italics, so listen up, kids. Posed in these strict conditions, the problem we are concerned with can be expressed in the following form. By what mechanism does the process of knowledge, which takes place entirely in thought, produce the cognitive appropriation of its real object, which exists outside the thought in the real world? Or again, by what mechanism does the production of the object of knowledge produce the cognitive appropriation of the real object, which exists outside thought in the real world? The mere substitution of the question of the mechanism of the cognitive appropriation of the real object by means of the object of knowledge for the ideological question of guarantees of the possibility of knowledge contains in it that mutation of the problematic which rescues us from the closed space of ideology and opens to us the open space of the philosophical theory we are seeking. Section 17. Before I go on to our question, let me run through the classic misunderstandings which lead us precisely back into the vicious circle of ideology. Our question is often given a straight answer simply by saying in the plain language of the pragmatism of, quote, obviousness, end quote, the mechanism with which the production of the object of knowledge produces the cognitive appropriation of the real object, ... Why? It is practice. It is the role of the criterion of practice. And if this dish does not fill us, they are pleased to vary the menu or provide as many accessories as are required to satisfy us. We are told practice is the touchstone, the practice of scientific experiment. Economic, political, technical practice, concrete practice, or else to convince us of the, quote, Marxist, end quote, character of the answer, social practice, or as, quote, as a, quote, make weight, end quote, the social practice of humanity repeated billions and billions of times for millennia. Or else we are served Engels' unfortunate pudding. Manchester provided Engels with the alimentary argument, quote, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, end quote. Exclamation point. First of all, I would point out that this kind of answer does have some effectivity, and that it should therefore be used when the aim is to defeat ideology on the terrain of ideology, i.e. when the aim is ideological struggle, strictly speaking. For it is an ideological answer, one which is situated precisely on the opponent's ideological terrain. In major historical situations, it has happened, and may happen again, that one is obliged or forced to fight on the terrain of the ideological opponent, when it has proved impossible to draw him into one's own terrain. Hello. I've been out here for a little bit now. If he is not ready to pitch his tents there, or if it is necessary to descend onto his terrain. But this practice and the mode of employment of ideological arguments adapted to this struggle must be the object of a theory, so that ideological struggle in the domain of ideology does not become a struggle governed by the laws and wishes of the opponent, so that it does not transform us purely into subjects of the ideology it is our aim to combat. And I would add at the same time that it is not surprising that this kind of pragmatist answer leaves us hungry as far as our theoretical question is concerned. We can show this for one general reason and a number of special reasons, all of which depend on the same principle. In fact, pragmatism in its essence drags our question into ideology by giving it an ideological answer. Pragmatism does nothing but set out, like the ideology of the idealist, quote, theory of knowledge, end quote, on a hunt for guarantees. The only difference is that classical idealism is not content with a de facto guarantee, but wants a de jure guarantee, though, as we know, this is merely the legal disguise for a de facto situation. That is, its business, whereas pragmatism sets out in search of a de facto guarantee, success in practice, which often constitutes the sole content assignable to what is called the, quote, practice criterion. At any rate, we are served with a guarantee which is the irrefutable index of an ideological question and answer, is where we are in search of a mechanism. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. So what? We are interested in the mechanism that ensures that it really is a pudding we are eating and not a poached baby elephant, though we think we are eating our daily pudding! Exclamation point. Proof by repetition for hundreds of thousands of years of the social practice of humanity, that night in which all the practices are gray. So what? For hundreds and thousands of years, this, quote, repetition, end quote, has produced, for example, quote, truths, end quote, such as the resurrection of Christ, the virginity of Mary, all the, quote, truths, end quote, of religion, all the prejudices of human, quote, spontaneity, end quote, i.e. all the established, quote, obviousness, end quote, of ideology, from the most to the least respectable, not to speak of the trap laid jointly by idealism and pragmatism in the complicity of their action, which obeys the same rules. By what right do you tell us that practice is right? Says idealism to pragmatism. Your right is no more than a disguised fact. Answers pragmatism. And we are back on the wheel, the closed circle of the ideological question. In all these cases, the common rule which permits this action is in fact the question of the guarantees of the harmony between knowledge or subject and its real object or object, i.e. capital O object, i.e. the ideological question as such. But let us leave this general argument for the special arguments, for they will bring us face to face with our object. It is enough to pronounce the word practice, which understood in an ideological, empiricist, or idealist way, is only the mirror image, the counter-connotation of theory, the pair of, quote, contraries, end quote, practice and theory constituting the two terms of a mirror field, to reveal the play on words that is its seat. We must recognize that there is no practice in general, but only distinct practices, which are not related in any Manichaean way with a theory which is opposed to them in every respect. For there is not on one side theory, a pure intellectual vision without body or materiality, and on the other side a completely material practice which, quote, gets its hands dirty, end quote. This dichotomy is merely an ideological myth in which a, quote, theory of knowledge, end quote, reflects many, quote, interests, end quote, other than those of reason, those of the social division of labor, which is precisely a division between power, political, religious, or ideological, and oppression, the executors who are also the executed, even when this dichotomy is the servant of a revolutionary vision, which exalts the workers' cause, their labor, their sufferings, their struggles, and their experience in the undifferentiated proclamation of the primacy of of practice. It still remains ideological, just as egalitarian communism is still an ideological conception of the aim of the workers' movement. In the strict sense, an egalitarian conception of practice, and I say this with the deep respect every Marxist owes to the experience and sacrifices of the men whose labor, sufferings, and struggles still nourish and sustain our whole present and future. All are arguments for life and hope. An egalitarian conception of practice is to dialectical materialism what egalitarian communism is to scientific communism, a conception to be criticized and superseded in order to establish a scientific conception of practice exactly in its place. 1 second. But there can be no scientific conception of practice without a precise distinction between the distinct practices and a new conception of the relations between theory and practice. We can assert the primacy of practice theoretically by showing that all the levels of social existence are the sites of distinct practices: economic practice, political practice, ideological practice, technical practice, and scientific or theoretical practice. We think the content of these different scientific... Sorry, fucking bug foot on my face. We think that the content of these different practices, by thinking their peculiar structure, which in all these cases is the structure of a production, by thinking what distinguishes between these different structures, i.e. the different natures of the objects to which they apply, or their means of production, and of the relations within which they produce, these different elements and their combination, Verbindung, obviously vary as we pass from economic practice to political practice, then to scientific practice and theoretico-philosophical practice. We think the relations establishing and articulating these different practices one with another by thinking their degree of independence and their type of, quote, relative and, quote, autonomy, which are themselves fixed by their type of dependence with respect to the practice which is, quote, determinate in the last instance, end quote, economic practice. But we shall go further. We are not content to suppress the egalitarian myth of practice. We acquire a completely new basis for our conception of the relation between theory and practice, which is mystified in any idealist or empiricist conception. We regard an element of, quote, knowledge, end quote, even in its most rudimentary forms, and even through its profoundly steeped ideology, is always already present in the earliest stages of practice, those that can be observed even in the subsistence practices of the most, quote, primitive, end quote, societies. As the other extreme in the history of practices, we regard what is commonly called theory, in theory's, quote, purest, end quote, forms, those that seem to bring into play the powers of thought alone, e.g. mathematics or philosophy, leaving aside any direct relation to, quote, concrete practice, end quote, as a practice in the strict sense, as scientific or theoretical practice, itself divisible into several branches, the different sciences, mathematics, philosophy. This practice is theoretical. It is distinguished from the other, non-theoretical practices by the type of object, raw material, which it transforms, by the type of means of production it sets to work, by the type of object it produces, knowledges. To speak of the criterion of practice, where theory is concerned and every other practice as well, then receives its full sense, for theoretical practice is indeed its own criterion, and contains in itself definite protocols with which it to validate the quality of its product, i.e. the criteria of the scientificity of the products of scientific practice. This is exactly what happens in the real practice of the sciences. Once they are truly constituted and developed, they have no need for verification from external practices to declare the knowledges they produce to be, quote, true, end quote, i.e. to be knowledges. No mathematician in the world waits until physics has verified a theorem to declare it proved. Although whole areas of mathematics are applied in physics, the truth of his theorem is 100% provided by criteria purely internal to the practice of mathematical proof, hence by the criterion of mathematical practice, i.e. by the forms required by existing mathematical scientificity. We can say the same for the results of every science, at least for the most developed of them, and in the areas of knowledge which they have sufficiently mastered. They themselves provide the criterion of validity of their knowledges, the criterion coinciding perfectly with the strict forms of the experience of the scientific practice considered. We can say this of the, quote, experimental, end quote, sciences. The criterion of their theory is their experiments, which constitute the form of their theoretical practice. We should say the same of the science which concerns us most particularly, historical materialism. It has been possible to apply Marxist theory with success because it is, quote, true, end quote. It is not true because it has been applied with success. The pragmatist criterion may suit a technique which has no other horizon than the field in which it is applied, but it does not suit scientific knowledges. To be consistent, we must go further and reject the more or less indirect assimilation of the Marxist theory of history to the empiricist model of a chance, quote, hypothesis, end quote, whose verification must be provided by the political practice of history before we can affirm its, quote, truth, end quote. Later, historical practice cannot give the knowledge that Marx produced, its status as knowledge, the criterion of the, quote, truth, end quote, of the knowledges produced by Marx's theoretical practice is provided by his theoretical practice itself, i.e. by the proof value, by the scientific status of the forms which ensured the production of those knowledges. Marx's theoretical practice is the criterion of the, quote, truth, end quote, of the knowledges that Marx produced, and only because it was really a matter of knowledge, and not of chance hypotheses, have these knowledges given the famous results, of which the failures as well as the successes constitute pertinent, quote, experiments, end quote, for the theory's reflection on itself and its internal development. In those sciences in which it is unrestrictedly valid, this radical inwardness of the criterion of practice for scientific practice is not at all exclusive of organic relations with other practices which provide these sciences with a large portion of their raw material, and occasionally goes so far as to induce more or less profound reorganizations in their theoretical structure. I have demonstrated this sufficiently elsewhere to prevent any misunderstanding of the meaning of what has just been said. In embryonic sciences and a fortiori in relations still dominated by an ideological, quote, knowledge, end quote, the intervention of these practices often plays a determinate critical role, which may even be revolutionary. I have suggested this in unambiguous terms. But here, too, there can be no question of drowning in an egalitarian conception of practice, either the specific mode of intervention of a determinate practice in the field of theoretical practice, which is still ideological or only just becoming scientific, or of drawing the precise function of this intervention, nor above all the theoretical form in which this intervention is effected. Taking Marx as an example, we know that his most personally significant practical experiences, his experience as a polemicist of the, quote, embarrassment of having to take part in discussions on so-called material interest, end quote, in the Rheinische Zeitung, his direct experience of the earliest struggle organizations of the Paris proletariat, his revolutionary experience in the 1848 period, intervened in Marx's theoretical practice and in the upheaval which led him from ideological theoretical practice to scientific theoretical practice, but they intervened in his theoretical practice in the form of objects of experience or even experiment, i.e. in the form of new thought objects, quote, ideas, end quote, and the concepts whose emergence contributed in their combination, their Verbindung, with other conceptual results, originating in German philosophy and English political economy, to the overthrow of the still ideological theoretical base on which he had lived, i.e. thought until then. New section, section 18. I make no apology for this long detour. It was not a detour. It was essential to clear from our way the ideological answers to our question, and to this end it was essential to reckon with an ideological conception of practice, which even Marxism itself has not always avoided, in which everyone still admit reigns supreme today, and surely for a long time to come, over contemporary philosophy, even over its most honest and generous representatives such as Sartre. By avoiding this marketplace of egalitarian practice, or as it has to be called in philosophy of, quote, praxis, end quote, we have won through to a recognition of the fact that there is only one path before us, a narrow path certainly, but an open, or at least openable path. Let us therefore return to our question. By what mechanism does the production of the object of knowledge produce the cognitive appropriation of the real object which exists outside thought in the real world? By what mechanism does the production of the object of knowledge produce the cognitive appropriation of the real object which exists outside thought in the real world? I say a mechanism, and a mechanism which must explain a specific fact, the mode of appropriation of the world by the specific practice of knowledge, whose entire space is its object, the object of knowledge as distinct from the real object of which it is the knowledge. Hence we run the greatest risks. The reader will understand that I can only claim, with the most explicit reservations, to give the first argument towards a sharpening of the question we have posed and not an answer to it. The first step in our formulation of this sharpening must be a very important distinction. When we pose the question of the mechanism by which the object of knowledge produces the cognitive appropriation of the real object, we are posing a quite different question from that of the conditions of the production of knowledge. This latter question is derived from a theory of the history of theoretical practice, which, as we have seen it, is only possible given the application of the concepts which enable us to think the structure of that practice and the history of its transformations. The question we are posing is a new question, a question which is precisely passed over in silence in the other. The theory of the history of knowledge, or theory of the history of theoretical practice, enables us to understand how human knowledges are produced in the history of the succession of different modes of production, first in the form of ideology, then in the form of science. It makes us spectators of the emergence of knowledges, their development, their diversification, the theoretical ruptures and upheavals within the problematic that governs their production, and of the progressive erection in their domain of a division between ideological knowledges and scientific knowledges, etc. At each moment of the history of knowledge, this history takes knowledge for what they are, knowledges for what they are, whether they declare themselves knowledges or not, whether they are ideological or scientific, etc., for knowledges. It considers them solely as products, as results. This history really does enable us to understand the mechanism of the production of knowledges, but given a production existing at a given moment in the process of the history of its production, it does not enable us to understand the mechanism by which the knowledge considered fulfills its function as a cognitive appropriation of the real object by means of its thought object for which is handling it, for whoever is handling it as a knowledge. But it's precisely this mechanism which interests us. One second. Need we sharpen our question even further? A theory of the history of the production of knowledges can only ever give us an observation. Here is the mechanism by which these knowledges have been produced. But this observation treats the knowledge as a fact, whose transformations and variations it studies so as so many effects of the structure of the theoretical practice which produces them, as so many products which happen to be knowledges, without ever reflecting the fact that these products are not just any products, but precisely knowledges. A theory of the history of the production of knowledges therefore does not account for what I propose to call the, quote, knowledge effect, end quote, which is the peculiarity of those special products which are knowledges. Our new question deals precisely with this knowledge effect, what Marx called the, quote, mode of appropriation of the world peculiar to knowledge, end quote. The mechanism I propose to elucidate is the mechanism which produces this knowledge effect in those very special products we call knowledges. Here, too, we shall never escape the destiny of having constantly to avoid false representations in order to clear the path that opens up the space for our investigation. We are confronted by illusions to be revoked and destroyed. We might indeed be tempted to refer the mechanism we are trying to discover to its origins, to say that this knowledge effect, which as far as we are concerned is exercised in the pure forms of some strict science, comes to us via an infinite series of mediations from reality itself. Thus in mathematics it is tempting to think the knowledge effect of such and such an especially abstract formula as the extreme purified and formalized echo of such and such a reality. Whether it is concrete space or the first concrete manipulations and operations of human practice. We can readily admit that a certain moment of quote dislocation and quote décalage intervenes between the concrete practice of the land surveyor and Pythagorean and Euclidean abstraction. But we can think this dislocation as a transfer, décalage, a retracing, décalage, of the concrete forms and gestures of an earlier practice and the element of, quote, ideality, end quote. But all the concepts we bring into play to account for the immense space which separates the Chaldean account or Egyptian land surveyor from Bourbaki will never be anything more than concepts which to attempt to install beneath the incontestable differences that have to be thought, a continuity of meaning which links in principle the knowledge effect of modern mathematical objects to an original meaning effect, which is an integral part of an original real object, a concrete practice, original concrete gestures. Thus there would be a, quote, native land, end quote, a, quote, original ground, end quote, of the knowledge effect, either the real object itself, from which, according to empiricism, knowledge only ever extracts one part, the essence or the Husserlian, quote, pre-reflexive, end quote, world of, quote, life, end quote, the passive anti-predictive synthesis, or finally, the concrete of elementary behavior and gestures, where all child psychologies, genetic or otherwise, obtain the cheap luxury of founding their own, quote, theories of knowledge, end quote. In all these cases, a real concrete living original is made eternally and integrally responsible for the knowledge effect. The sciences throughout their history and even today are merely commenting on this heritage, i.e. subject to this heredity. Just as in good Christian theology, humanity lives only in original sin, there would be an original knowledge effect. An original knowledge effect emerging from the more concrete forms of the real, from life, from practice, i.e. losing itself in them, identical with them, an original knowledge effect whose indelible mark would still be borne today by the most, quote, abstract, end quote, scientific objects, destined as they are to its fate, condemned to knowledge. Need I set out the problematic presupposed by this quote, model, end quote? The reader will have guessed that that its consistency requires support from the myth of the origin, from an original unity undivided between subject and object, between the real and its knowledge, that they have the same birth. That as someone well versed in theatrical effects remarked, knowledge is co-birth, les connaissances sont co-naissance. From a good genesis, from all the indispensable abstractions, and above all, mediations. The reader will have recognized in this passage a set of typical concepts which 18th century philosophy scattered over the world and which have flourished nearly everywhere, even in the works of Marxist specialists, but concepts which we can be absolutely sure, tailor-made as they are for the ideological functions expected of them, have nothing to do with Marx. And while we are here, let us be clear, Marxism cannot for one moment discover or rediscover itself along the path of this empiricism, whether it claims to be materialist or sublimates itself in an idealism of the anti-predictive, of the, quote, original ground, end quote, or of, quote, praxis, end quote. In this idealism and in the concepts it is manufactured to play the star roles in its theater, the concept of origin, quote, original ground, end quote, genesis and mediation should be regarded as suspect a priori, not because they always more or less induce the ideology which has produced them, but because, produced solely for the use of this ideology, they are its nomads, always more or less carrying it with them, it is no accident that Sartre, and all those with none of his ability who feel a need to fill in the emptiness between, quote, abstract categories and the, quote, concrete, abuse the terms origin, genesis, and mediations so much. Origins, genesis, and mediations. The function of the concept of origin, as in original sin, is to summarize in one word what is not to be thought in order to be able to think what one wants to think. The concept of genesis is charged with taking charge of and masking a production or mutation whose recognition would threaten the vital continuity of the empiricist schema of history. The concept of mediation is invested with one last role, the magical provision of post-stations in the empty space between theoretical principles and the, quote, concrete, end quote, as bricklayers make a chain to pass bricks. In every case, the functions are those of masks and theoretical impostures, functions which may witness both to a real embarrassment and a real goodwill, and to the desire not to lose theoretical control over events. But even in the best of cases, these functions are more or less dangerous theoretical fictions. Applied to our question, these concepts ensure us a cheap solution on every occasion. They make a chain between an original knowledge effect and current knowledge effects, giving us the mere posing, or rather non-posing, of the problem as its solution. Section 19. Let us therefore try taking a few steps forward into the space we have just disengaged. Just as we saw that recourse to a primitive real object could not save us from our responsibility to think the difference between the object of knowledge and the real object, of which the first object gives us the knowledge, we have just seen that we cannot shift to an original, quote, knowledge effect, end quote, the responsibility for thinking for us the mechanism of this contemporary knowledge effect. And to tell the truth, we know that these two problems are really one and the same, since only the reality of the contemporary knowledge effect, not the myth of an original effect, can give us the answer we are looking for. In this respect, we are in the same situation as Marx, who says in so many words that we must elucidate the knowledge of the, quote, Gliederung, the articulated hierarchized systematic combination of contemporary society, if we are to reach an understanding of earlier forms, and therefore the most primitive forms. His famous remark that the, quote, the anatomy of man is the key to the anatomy of the ape, end quote, of course means nothing else. Of course it coincides with that other remark in the 1857 introduction, that is not the historical genesis of categories, nor their combination in earlier forms that enables us to understand them, but the system of their combination in a contemporary society, which also opens the way to an understanding of past formations. By giving us the concept of the variation of this combination, similarly, only the elucidation of the mechanism of the contemporary world, of the contemporary knowledge effect, can cast light onto earlier effects. The rejection of any recourse to origins is therefore correlated with a very basic theoretical exigency, which insists on the dependence of the explanation of more primitive forms on the contemporary mode of systematic combination of categories, which are also found in part in earlier forms. We must regard this exigency as constitutive of Marxist theory. Precisely in the domain of the theory of history. Let me explain. When Marx studied modern bourgeois society, he adopted a paradoxical attitude. He first conceived that existing society as a historical result, i.e. as a result produced by a history. Naturally, this seems to commit us to a Hegelian conception in which the result is conceived as a result inseparable from its genesis, to the point where it is necessary to conceive it as, quote, the result of its becoming, end quote. In fact, at the same time, Marx takes a quite different direction. Quote, the point is not the historic position of the economic relations in the succession of different forms of society, even less is it their sequence, quote, in the idea, end quote, Proudhon, a muddy notion of historic movement, rather their articulated combination, Gliederung, within modern bourgeois society, end quote, Grundrisse. The same idea was already rigorously expressed in The Poverty of Philosophy. Quote, How indeed could the single logical formula of movement, of sequence, of time, explain the body of society in which all relations coexist simultaneously, gleichzeitig, and support one another, end quote. The object of Marx's study is therefore contemporary bourgeois society, which is thought as a historical result, but the understanding of this society, far from being obtained from the theory of the genesis of this result, is on the contrary obtained exclusively from the theory of the, quote, body, end quote, i.e. of the contemporary structure of society, without its genesis intervening in any way whatsoever. This attitude may be paradoxical, but Marx insists on it in categorical terms as the absolute condition of possibility for his theory of history. It reveals the existence of two problems, distinct in their disjoint unity. There is a theoretical problem which must be posed and resolved in order to explain the mechanism by which history has produced, as its result, the contemporary capitalist mode of production. But at the same time, there is another absolutely distinct problem which must be posed and resolved in order to understand that this result is indeed a social mode of production, that this result is precisely a form of social existence, and not just any form of existence. This social problem is the object of the theory in capital, and not for one moment is it ever confused with the first problem. One second. We can express this distinction, which is absolutely fundamental for an understanding of Marx, by saying that Marx regards contemporary society and every other past form of society both as a result and as a society. The theory of the mechanism of transformation of one mode of production into another, i.e. the theory of the forms of transition from one mode of production to the succeeding one, has to pose and solve the problem of the result, i.e. the historical production of a given mode of production of a given social formation. But contemporary society is not only a result, a product. It is this particular result, this particular product, which functions as a society, unlike other results and their products which function quite differently. This second problem is answered by the theory of the structure of a mode of production, the theory of capital. In capital, society is taken as a, quote, body, not just as any body, but as that body which functions as a society. That body which functions as a society. This theory completely abstracts from society as a result, which is why Marx claims that no explanation by movement, sequence, time, and genesis can apply to this problem in principle, for it is a quite different problem. To say the same thing in more pertinent terms, I suggest the following terminology. What Marx studies in Capital is the mechanism which makes the result of a history's production exist as a society. I actually really like that. I suggest the following terminology. What Marx studies in Capital is the mechanism which makes the result of a history's production exist as a society. It is therefore the mechanism which gives this product of history, that is, precisely the society product he is studying, the property of producing the, quote, society effect, end quote, which makes this result exist as a society, and not as a heap of sand, an anthill, a workshop, or a mere collection of men. When Marx tells us, therefore, that in explaining society by its genesis we miss its, quote, body, end quote, precisely what had to be explained, he is focusing his theoretical attention on the task of explaining the mechanism by which some particular result functions precisely as a society, and therefore the mechanism producing the, quote, society effect, end quote, peculiar to the capitalist mode of production. The mechanism of the production of this, quote, society effect, end quote, is only complete when all the effects of the mechanism have been expounded, down to the point where they are produced in the form of the very effects that constitute the concrete, conscious or unconscious relation of the individuals to the society as a society, i.e. down to the effects of the fetishism of ideology, or, quote, forms of social consciousness, end quote, preface to a contribution in which men consciously or unconsciously live their lives. their projects, their actions, their attitudes, and their functions as social. In this perspective, the book Capital must be regarded as the theory of the mechanism of production of the society effect in the capitalist mode of production. We are beginning to suspect, even if it is only because of the works of contemporary ethnology and history, that this society effect differs with different modes of production. Theoretically speaking, we have every reason to believe that the mechanism of the production of these different society effects differs with the various modes of production. We are beginning to see that an exact consciousness of the precise problem implied by the theory in Capital opens new horizons in front of us by posing us new problems. But at the same time, we understand the absolutely decisive scope of those few lucid sentences from The Poverty of Philosophy in the 1857 introduction, in which Marx warns us that he is looking not for an understanding of the mechanism of the production of society as a result of history, but for an understanding of the mechanism of the production of the society effect by this result, which is effectively a real existing society. By thus defining his object with this merciless distinction, Marx provides us with the wherewithal to pose the problem we are concerned with, the problem of the cognitive appropriation of the real object by the object of knowledge, which is a special case of the appropriation of the real world by different practices, theoretical, aesthetic, religious, ethical, technical, etc. Each of these modes of appropriation poses the problem of the mechanism of production of its specific, quote, effect, end quote. Its specific, quote, effect, end quote. The knowledge effect for theoretical practice, the aesthetic effect for aesthetic practice, the ethical effect for ethical practice, etc. In each of these cases, we cannot merely substitute one word for another, as, quote, dormitive virtue, end quote, was substituted for opium. The search for each of these specific, quote, effects, end quote, demands the elucidation of the mechanism that produces it, not the reduplication of one word by the magic of another. If we want to avoid prejudging the conclusion to which the study of these different effects may lead us, we must be content with a few indications as to the effect that concerns us here, the knowledge effect, produced by the existence of the theoretical object, which is a knowledge. The expression knowledge effect constitutes a generic object, which includes at least two sub-objects, the ideological knowledge effect and the scientific knowledge effect. The ideological knowledge effect is distinguished by its properties. It is an effect of misrecognition in a mirror relation from the scientific knowledge effect. But insofar as the ideological effect, although it depends on other social functions which are dominant in it, really possesses its own knowledge effect, it falls in this respect within the general category which we are concerned. I owe the reader this warning in order to prevent any misunderstanding as to the beginnings of an analysis that follows, for it is centered solely on the knowledge effect of scientific knowledge. How can we explain the mechanism of this knowledge effect? We can now return to something we have just established, the inwardness of the, quote, criterion of practice, end quote, to the scientific practice under consideration, and we suggest that our present question is related to this inwardness. We show that the validity of scientific proposition as a knowledge is ensured in a determinate scientific practice, by the action of particular forms, which ensure the presence of scientificity in the production of knowledge. In other words, by specific forms that confer on a knowledge its character as a, quote, true, end quote, knowledge. Here I am speaking of forms of scientificity, but I am also echoing this by thinking of the forms that play the same part, ensuring a different but corresponding effect in ideological, quote, knowledge, end quote, and indeed in all forms of knowing. These forms are distinct from the forms in which the knowledge was produced. As a result, by the process of the history of knowledge, They deal, it will be remembered, with a knowledge already produced as a knowledge by that history. In other words, we consider the result without its becoming, ignoring any accusations of less egalianism or less geneticism, for this double crime is merely a single good deed, a liberation from the empiricist ideology of history. It is to this result that we put the question of the mechanism of production of the knowledge effect, exactly in the way Marx interrogated a given society. As a result, in order to pose it, the question of its, quote, society effect, end quote, or the question of the mechanism which produces its existence as a society. We see the specific forms in action in the discourse of scientific proof, i.e. in the phenomenon which imposes on thought categories or concepts a regular order of appearance and disappearance. A regular order of appearance and disappearance. We can say then that the mechanism of production of the knowledge effect lies in the mechanism which underlies the action of the forms of order in the scientific discourse of the proof. I say the mechanism which underlies and does not just govern the action of these forms for the following reason. In fact, these forms of order only show themselves as forms of the order of appearance of concepts in scientific discourse as a function of other forms which, without themselves being forms of order, are nevertheless the absent principle of the latter. To speak in a language which has already caught on the forms of order, forms of proof in scientific discourse are the, quote, diachrony, end quote, of a basic, quote, synchrony, end quote. I'm using these terms in a way which will be defined precisely later, in Part 4, as the concepts of the two forms of existence of the object of knowledge, and hence as two forms existing purely inside knowledge. Synchrony represents the organizational structure of the concept in the thought totality, or system, or as Marx puts it, quote, synthesis, end quote. Diachrony, the movement of the succession of the concepts in the ordered discourse of the proof. The forms of order of the discourse of the proof are simply the development of the Gliederung, of the hierarchized combination of the concepts in the system itself. When I say that, quote, synchrony, end quote, thus understood is primary and governs everything, I mean two things. One, that the system of the hierarchy of concepts and their combination determines the definition of each concept as a function of its place and function in the system. Is this definition of the place and function of the concept in the totality of the system, which is reflected in the immanent meaning of this concept when we put it in one-to-one correspondence with its real category. 2, that the system of the hierarchy of concepts determines the, quote, diachronic, end quote, order of their appearance in the discourse of the proof. It is in this sense that Marx speaks of the, quote, development of the forms, end quote, of the concept of value, surplus value, etc. This, quote, development of the forms, end quote, is the manifestation in the discourse of the scientific proof of the systematic dependence which links the concepts together in the system of the thought totality. The knowledge effect, produced at the level of the forms of order of the discourse of the proof, and then at the level of some isolated concept, is therefore possible given the systematicity of the system, which is the foundation of the concepts and their order of appearance in scientific discourse. The knowledge effect acts then in the duality or duplicity of the existence of the system, which is said to, quote, develop, end quote, in the scientific discourse on the one hand, and on the other of the existence of the forms of order of the discourse, precisely in the, quote, play, end quote, in the mechanical sense of the term, which constitutes the unity of dislocation of the system and the discourse. This knowledge effect is produced as an effect of the scientific discourse, which exists only as a discourse of the system, i.e. of the object grasped in the structure of its complex constitution. If this analysis leads anywhere, it leads us to the threshold of the following new question. What is the specific difference of scientific discourse as a discourse? What distinguishes scientific discourse from other forms of discourse? How do other discourses produce different effects? Aesthetic effect, ideological effect, unconscious effect, from the knowledge effect which is produced by scientific discourse. Section 20. I shall leave the question in this last form and merely recall its terms. Unlike the, quote, theory of knowledge, end quote, of ideological philosophy, I am not trying to pronounce some de jure or de facto guarantee which will assure us that we really do know what we know, and that we can relate this harmony to a certain connection between subject and object, consciousness and the world. I am trying to elucidate the mechanism which explains to us how a de facto result produced by the history of knowledge, i.e. a given determinate knowledge, functions as a knowledge, and not as some other result, a hammer, a symphony, a sermon, a political slogan, etc. I am therefore trying to define its specific effect, the knowledge effect, by an understanding of its mechanism. If this question has been properly put, protected from all the ideologies that still weigh us down, i.e. outside the field of the ideological concepts by which the, quote, problem of knowledge, end quote, is usually posed, it will lead us to the question of the mechanism by which forms of order, determined by the system of the existing object of knowledge, produce, by the action of their relation to that system, the knowledge effect considered. This last question confronts us definitively with the differential nature of scientific discourse, i.e., with the specific nature of a discourse which cannot be maintained as a discourse except by reference to what is present as absence in each moment of its order, the constitutive system of its object, which in order to exist as a system, requires the absent presence of the scientific discourse that, quote, develops it. If I stop here for a threshold we shall still have to cross, allow me to recall that it is the peculiarity of scientific discourse to be written, and that it therefore poses us the question of the form of its writing. The reader will probably remember that we began with its reading. We have therefore not left the circle of one and the same question. If, without leaving it, we have avoided turning round in this circle, it is because this circle is not the closed circle of ideology, but the circle perpetually opened by its closures themselves, the circle of a well-founded knowledge. Louis Althusser, June 1965, the end. I want you to know that I think I might have set a little PR for myself in that I didn't read this all in one sitting, but I started reading it from page 29, from my last sitting, to page 72 in one sitting. So I've been reading here for, let's see what the timer says. Two hours and 41 minutes. So I thank you for listening.